The car is upside down in the trees, and it has been upside down long enough that the rain has found a way inside it. One headlight still works. Its beam points into a wall of evergreens at an angle that makes the whole forest look tilted, like the world got knocked off its shelf while nobody was watching. A man crawls out of that wreck with blood on his forehead and no memory of driving it. 7 days are missing from his life. He does not know that yet. What he knows, standing in the dark on a mountain road in Washington, is that his wife is gone and that he has to find her, and that somewhere in the trees ahead of him there are pages of a book he never wrote, describing things that have not happened yet. That man spends the next several nights fighting his way across a small logging town, following those pages until he reaches the bottom of a lake and writes an ending. And when he types the last line and looks up from the typewriter, a voice says his name and tells him to wake up. Almost everybody who has finished this story hears that line the same way. It sounds like rescue. To most ears, it is the moment the nightmare finally lets go of him. Consider the possibility that it is the opposite. The town this happens in is called Bright Falls, roughly a few hundred people in the mountains of Washington. Founded in the 1870s to house men working the coal mines, kept alive since then by tourists who come for the national park and stay for the festival. It has a diner, a radio station, a sheriff who knows everyone by name, and a lake that goes down further than almost any lake in the state. Old stories in the area, going back long before the town existed, called that lake a door to somewhere underneath. The people telling those stories were not writing fiction. They were describing a place that had already done something to somebody. Newspaper records from that stretch of the Pacific Northwest show the region producing strange accounts for at least a century and a half. Not one incident, a steady drip of them, the kind of local weirdness that gets filed under folklore because filing it anywhere else would require somebody to act. What follows is a full reading of the Bright Falls incident from the inside out, built as original interpretation rather than a retelling of the plot beats in order. Along the way, this will pull in real research on memory, on grief, on guilt, and on how people behave when they are handed power they do not understand, because the strangest thing about this story is how little of it requires anything supernatural to make sense. By the end, you will have a complete answer to one question. When the story tells you that Alan wakes up, what is he waking into, and who is doing the waking? The answer changes almost every scene that comes before it, and it explains why the ending feels wrong to so many people who cannot quite say why. We are going to move roughly in the order the story moves, with detours backward wherever the present cannot be understood without the past. The wreck and the missing week first, then the vacation that was never really a vacation, and the marriage underneath it. After that, the lake itself, and the man who found out what it could do 40 years before Alan ever arrived, and what learning it cost him. From there, the people around Alan, who each held a piece of the truth and each failed, in their own specific way, to hand it over in time. And finally, the bottom of the water, the last page, and the sentence everybody remembers. Somewhere in the middle of that there is a chapter I suspect will change how you hear the ending. And it is not the one about the monster. It is the one about a woman who spent 4 decades of her life doing maintenance on light bulbs and was treated as the town eccentric for it. There is one thread I am going to keep pulling on from the first minute to the last. Through a poet in 1970, a psychiatrist with a private art collection, a woman who spent 40 years maintaining light bulbs, and a novelist who could not write a word for 2 years. Nobody in this valley gets to wake up and walk away. Waking up here means taking the pen. If some part of this lore for sleep lands for you, drop a comment and tell me which part it was, whether that was a detail you never noticed, a connection you made on your own, or just a moment that stuck to you. Toss out a suggestion for what should get covered next. I am always looking for the next thing to disappear into for a few weeks, and a lot of the best ones have come from you. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let us begin where the story itself insists on beginning, which is 1 full week after the important part is already over. Chapter 1: The Week That Vanished. We are starting at the wreck, because the story starts at the wreck. And that choice is the first thing worth interrogating. Alan Wake comes back into himself on a forest road with a gash on his head and a flashlight he does not remember picking up. The car around him is destroyed. Rain moves sideways through the headlight beam. He is roughly a week past the last thing he can remember, which was diving into a black lake after his wife. Between that dive and this road, there is nothing at all. Not a blur, not a bad dream he half recalls. Nothing. A clean hole where 7 days used to be. He does not react to this the way a person actually reacts to losing a week. Instead, he behaves the way a man in a thriller behaves, getting up and moving toward the nearest light. Hold on to that. It matters later. What he finds on the way down that road is a page, loose paper, typed, describing a scene in a book called Departure. His name is on it. He never wrote it. Reading it, he recognizes his own sentence rhythm, his own habits, the specific way he opens a paragraph. Everything about it is his except the memory of writing it, and the scene on the page has not happened yet. Then it happens. There is a particular kind of horror in that sequence which has nothing to do with monsters, and the game gets to it before it introduces a single one. A man loses a week and finds evidence that he spent that week working. Not resting, not drinking, not wandering, working. Somebody sat him at a machine, and he produced pages, and those pages are now out in the world doing things. Real medicine has language for the gap itself. Extended blank periods in memory, where a person continues functioning and interacting with the world while forming no lasting record of it, are documented and reasonably well understood. Head trauma can do it. Alcohol can do it, in a form where the drinker holds conversations and drives cars and remembers none of it afterward. Severe psychological stress can do it too, which is the version that tends to interest researchers most, because in those cases the brain is not damaged so much as it is protecting itself by refusing to file the experience where the rest of the person can reach it. The body was present. Somewhere in the autobiography a page has been torn out. All three of those explanations are available to Alan on that road. He has a head wound. There is a documented history with alcohol, and he has just watched his wife go under black water. A rational man, standing in that rain, would consider all three. He considers none of them, and the story is careful to show us that he does not. This is the first real crack, and almost nobody notices it on a first pass, because the game has just given you a flashlight and something to shoot at. Alan Wake, a professional writer of crime novels, a man whose entire career was built on constructing plausible chains of cause and effect, encounters the single most alarming fact of his adult life and does not investigate it. He walks past it toward the plot, treating his own missing week as backstory rather than as the crime scene, which is exactly what the manuscript needs him to do. Here is the shape of the thing. Every horror story has an engine, and the engine of this one is not the darkness. The engine is a story that has already been written, moving toward its own ending, requiring a protagonist who will hit the marks, a protagonist who stops to seriously ask what happened during the missing week, would derail it in the first 20 minutes. Somebody who accepts the frame and starts chasing his wife will deliver the ending on schedule. Alan is the second kind. From the moment he stands up in that forest, he is behaving like a character, and the reason he is behaving like a character is that someone wrote him as one, somebody being him. Sit with the recursion for a second, because it is going to come back with more weight later. The pages he finds are the reason he acts. His acting is what makes the pages come true. Neither one leads, they spin. There is a small verbal habit Alan picks up in this stretch that most people file as flavor. He introduces himself, out loud to nobody, more than once. My name is Alan Wake, I am a writer. He says it at the start of this, and he says it again in later chapters of his life. At moments when things have come apart badly enough that the sentence is doing something other than introducing him. That line is a hand on a railing. When a person's sense of continuity has been damaged, when there is a hole in the record and they cannot verify their own recent past, one of the reliable responses is to reach for the parts of identity that do not depend on memory at all. A name, an occupation, things that were true before the gap and are still true after it. He is not telling us who he is, what he is doing is checking, and the answer he keeps checking against is writer. not husband. The first thing he grabs onto, standing in a forest with his wife missing, is the job. Consider also how the pages arrive. They are not delivered in order. Instead, they lie strewn across the entire county, in glove compartments and on picnic tables and pinned to trees, scattered so thoroughly that no reasonable person could collect them in sequence. Alan finds page 40 before page 11. He reads the ending of a scene before he knows the scene is coming. That scattering is doing something specific to him. A person receiving information out of order about their own immediate future is placed in a peculiar mental state. They cannot plan because they do not have the shape of the thing. All that stays available to them is bracing. Every page is a warning without enough context to act on, which means every page increases dread while decreasing agency. If you wanted to break somebody's capacity for independent decision-making without ever touching them, this is close to how you would do it. Feed them fragments of a script they are already inside. Make the fragments accurate often enough that they stop testing them. Let them conclude, on their own, that following the pages is the only sane move available. By the third or fourth page, Alan is no longer deciding where to go. He is confirming. There is one more detail from that first night worth flagging, because it is easy to lose in the chaos. When Alan reaches the first houses and the first pockets of electric light, he finds a man he will later learn is named Carl Stuckey. Stuckey rents cabins in the area. By the time Alan meets him, he is no longer entirely a person. He comes out of the dark, wrapped in something that eats the flashlight beam, swinging an axe, saying things that are almost sentences and almost his own. Notice what the darkness does not do. It does not create these people. Nothing gets imported from somewhere else and set loose in the woods. What happens instead is that it finds people who are already there, who already live in this valley and have their own jobs and their own reasons for being out at night, and it wears them. The threat in Bright Falls is entirely local. It is neighbors. Every single thing that tries to kill Alan Wake over the following nights was a resident of that county the week before. That is a design choice, and it is doing thematic work. A horror where the monster comes from outside is a horror about invasion. Assemble that monster out of the locals instead, and you have a horror about a place, and about what the place was always capable of. Nothing arrives in Bright Falls. Something surfaces. Listen to what they say while they are trying to kill him, though, because this is the detail that turns the whole thing from a combat mechanic into something sadder. They talk, constantly, fragments, complaints about work, half-finished thoughts about somebody they were supposed to meet, small circular grievances of the kind a person mutters to themselves while doing a chore they resent. The possessed loggers of Bright Falls come at Alan Wake muttering about their jobs. Whatever has hold of them has not erased them. It has left the surface running, the way a radio left on in an empty house keeps producing a voice. Underneath the darkness, the person is still generating the same small loop of thought they were generating that morning, and it comes out of them while their body does something they never agreed to. There is an image that fits here better than most. Think of a marionette where the strings have been taken over, but the mouth is still connected to the original wiring. The body belongs to something else. Their talking is still their own. That combination is more disturbing than silence would be, and the story clearly knows it because it never once lets them shut up. Something else worth flagging. Light does not kill these people. What it does is strip whatever is covering them, and only after that does anything conventional work, which means every fight in this story has two stages, and the first stage is exposure. You cannot touch the thing until you have made it visible. That is going to turn out to be the operating principle of the entire narrative, applied to people, to institutions, and eventually to Alan himself. By the time Alan makes it to a gas station and gets picked up, he has already established the pattern he will follow for the rest of the story. He moves toward light. Pages get collected. Never once does he stop to ask why he is doing either of those things. Somebody handed him a roll on that road, and the roll came with a flashlight, and he took both without checking who was offering. The week that vanished is not a mystery the story is saving for the end. It is the answer, sitting in plain sight in the first 10 minutes, waiting for him to turn around and look at it. He will eventually. It will take 4 episodes, a jar of homemade liquor, and a complete collapse of everything he thinks he knows about his own marriage, and by then the pages will already be most of the way to their ending. Before we can understand why he cannot look back, we have to look back ourselves, at the 2 days before the lake, when a man who had not written a word in 2 years was handed a typewriter by the person he trusted most. Chapter 2. A typewriter on the table. Rewind to the ferry. Bright Falls arrives the way small tourist towns arrive, in pieces. Water, then trees, then a dock, then a main street with a diner on it, and a festival banner going up for the season. Alan and Alice Wake come in from New York for a vacation, and from the outside it looks like exactly that. A famous novelist and his photographer wife, taking 2 weeks in the mountains. Almost every person Alan meets in the first hour recognizes him. The radio host wants an interview on the boat. A waitress at the diner turns out to be a fan, an intense one, the kind who has read everything and wants him to know it. Sheriff Breaker mentions that her father reads him. There is a cardboard cutout of him standing in the corner of the diner, which is a small and genuinely uncomfortable detail once you know how this ends, because it means a flat paper version of Alan Wake is already standing in that town before the real one walks in. He is short with all of them, polite in a way that is clearly costing him something. This is a man who came here specifically to not be looked at, and he has been recognized 4 times before lunch. The waitress deserves a moment on her own, because she becomes important, and because the story is doing something careful with her. Her name is Rose Marigold. She works at the diner. Every one of his books has been read, and there is a wall in her home dedicated to him, and when he walks in, she cannot regulate herself at all, talking too fast, saying too much, treating a stranger like someone she has known for years, which, in the only way available to her, she has. The relationship a reader builds with a writer is genuinely one-sided and genuinely real at the same time. Researchers who study this have found that the emotional machinery people use for actual friendships does not distinguish very well between somebody they know and somebody whose interior voice they have spent 200 hours inside. The brain files intimacy where it finds it. 6 novels of a man's private sentence rhythms is more sustained exposure to his mind than most people get from a coworker of a decade. So Rose is not deluded. She is responding correctly to an experience she actually had, using the only social script that fits it. What she cannot know is that the man she is meeting does not have the corresponding half, and that the discrepancy between what she feels and what he feels is the exact gap something is about to reach into. The darkness in this valley works through attachment. It takes the thing a person wants most and shows up wearing it. Rose wants Alan Wake to see her. Later, something is going to arrange for exactly that, and she will do what it asks, and she will believe the entire time that she is helping. Keep her in mind. What happens to Rose is one of the quieter cruelties in this story, and it happens because she was warm. Then a woman in a black dress hands him the cabin keys. She is dressed for a funeral, in the middle of a summer afternoon, in a diner full of tourists. Alan clocks it and feels something he cannot name, and takes the keys anyway. He has no reason not to. Someone is supposed to give him keys, and here is someone giving him keys, and the fact that she is dressed to bury somebody does not rise to the level of a reason to ask questions. That woman is Barbara Jagger, and she has been dead since 1970. Hold that image, because it is the entire mechanism of this story in one gesture. The thing that destroys Alan Wake does not break into his life. It hands him something he was already reaching for. The cabin sits on a small island in the middle of Cauldron Lake, connected to the shore by a narrow strip. Bird leg cabin, named for the shape of the island itself. It is beautiful in the way expensive isolation is always beautiful. Wraparound views, water on every side, absolute quiet. Alan walks the perimeter, looks at the mountains, and lets himself relax for what is probably the first time in 2 years. Then he goes inside and finds the typewriter. Alice has set it up in the study, paper already in it, and she tells him, gently, that she thinks the change of scenery might help, and that there is a doctor here, a psychiatrist named Emil Hartman who specializes in blocked artists, and that she has already been in contact with him. Alan detonates. He grabs a flashlight and walks out of the cabin into the dark, leaving her alone inside. And while he is out there, the power fails and he hears her scream. Everything after that is consequence. Let us slow down on what actually happened in that room, because the fight is usually treated as a plot device to get Alan outside at the right moment, and it is doing considerably more than that. What Alice did has a real-world shape, and it is a shape with a well-documented failure mode. Bringing someone to a location under one pretext, and then revealing on arrival that the location was chosen because a professional is waiting, is a recognizable pattern. It gets used with addiction, with depression, with the kind of long, slow decline that a family watches happen and cannot talk about directly. The intent behind it is almost always love. Whoever arranges it has usually been carrying the situation alone for a long time, has usually tried the direct conversation and gotten nowhere, and has concluded that surprise is the only tool left. Research on how these arrangements actually land has been fairly consistent about the risk. Approaches built on ambush tend to produce a specific reaction in the person on the receiving end, and that reaction is rarely the intended one. What gets triggered first is not insight. It is the sudden understanding that the people closest to you have been having conversations about you without you, that a version of your problem has been assembled and discussed and planned around in rooms you were not in. Even when every word of that assessment is accurate, the discovery of it lands as a breach. The concern is real, and the betrayal is also real, and the second one usually gets to the person first. Alice was not wrong about Alan. He had not written in 2 years. Sleep had mostly stopped coming, and he was drinking, and he had put his hands on a journalist in public. She was watching someone she loved come apart at a rate she could not slow down, and she reached for the one lever she had left. And the lever backfired in the specific way it usually backfires, which is that Alan did not hear "I am worried about you." He heard "I have decided what is wrong with you." Now add the part that makes this genuinely cruel, which the game does not underline and which reframes the entire scene once you have it. Emil Hartman contacted her. Alice found him through his book, and they corresponded, and Hartman encouraged her to bring her husband to Bright Falls. From her side, that was a specialist taking an interest. Seen from his, it was recruitment. Hartman had spent decades trying to get creative people within range of that lake, and here was a famous novelist with a wife desperate enough to bring him personally. So the fight in the study is not really between Alan and Alice. Both of them are standing inside a decision that was made for them somewhere else, by a man who wanted Alan on that island for reasons neither of them could guess. Alice thought she was choosing a doctor. She was answering an invitation. There is a term for what Hartman is doing that comes out of research on how people get pulled into situations they would never have chosen directly. The most effective version rarely involves pressuring the target at all. It involves finding the person adjacent to the target, the one who already wants something to change, and giving them a plan. That person then does all the persuading, for free, with total sincerity, because they believe in it. The target never sees the hand that moved them. They only see the person they love, holding out a typewriter. Which brings us back to the object itself, because the typewriter is the piece of this scene that has been sitting there the whole time being more important than it looks. Alice put a writing machine in a cabin on Cauldron Lake and asked her husband to use it. She had no way of knowing what that meant. Nobody outside a small circle in that town knew what that meant. But the lake responds to made things, and she carried a machine for making things onto an island in the middle of it and set it up facing the water. The horror of that room is not the fight. It is that both people in it were trying to help, one out of love and one out of appetite, and the setup they produced between them was the most dangerous possible arrangement of objects in that valley. And there is a version of this scene that keeps happening in the real world at much lower stakes, which is why it registers as uncomfortable rather than as fantasy. Someone worried about a person they love goes looking for help. The help they find is offered by somebody with a business model. That worried person cannot evaluate the difference, because they are not a specialist and because their judgment is already compromised by fear. They hand over the one thing they were trying to protect, sincerely, gratefully, and the transaction looks like care from every angle inside it. Institutions that profit from desperation do not need to be sinister to be dangerous. They only need to be positioned where the desperate go looking. Hartman wrote a book, put it where the frightened spouses of struggling artists would find it, and waited. He waited for a very long time. Alice was not his first attempt, and Alan was not his first patient. The lodge on the ridge above the lake had been running for years by the time these two came up the road, full of blocked painters and burned-out writers who had all arrived through some version of the same door. Alan walked out. The lights went out. Alice fell. And before we can follow him into the water, there is a question this chapter has left open that we have to answer first, because it changes who we think this story is actually about. Alice is the one who screams. She is also the one who goes under. And she is the only person left in that marriage who is still afraid of the dark, which is not a coincidence, because the reason she was down there alone has a much longer history than one bad argument. Chapter 3. The Man Who Left. Picture the study again, 30 seconds after the door slams. Alice is standing in a wooden house on an island, at night, in a place with no neighbors, and the power has just failed. Every light in the building is gone at once. She is alone, and she is terrified, and the specific thing she is terrified of is the absence of light. Alice Wake has a phobia of the dark, not a discomfort, a phobia, the clinical kind, the kind you organize your life around. She and Alan met in New York when they were both young and going nowhere in particular, and she had it then. Alan knew. He had married her knowing. Then he walked out of a house on an island at night, with a flashlight in his hand, and left her inside it. He did not know the power would fail. That much is fair. What he knew was that he was leaving his nyctophobic wife alone in an unfamiliar building after dark because she had hurt his feelings. Let us talk about who Alan Wake actually is, because the story is quite honest about this and audiences tend to be generous with him anyway. He grew up without a father he ever knew, raised by his mother. As a child he was terrified of the dark, convinced of monsters in it, and would fight sleep as long as he physically could, rather than lie down in a room with the lights off. His mother eventually gave him a broken light switch to hold. She told him that flipping it would drive the monsters away. He believed her, and over time the fear receded. He read horror. Eventually he started writing his own. His first story got published young. Then he built a long-running crime series around a hard New York cop named Alex Casey, 6 books, and became genuinely famous. Before any of that worked, he took whatever jobs would keep him fed in New York while he looked for something to write about. One of those jobs was working nights as a watchman. Think about that for a moment against everything else we know about him. A man who spent his childhood unable to sleep because of what he believed was in the dark, grew up and took a job that consisted of sitting awake in empty buildings all night. Some people manage fear by avoiding it. Others manage it by moving in. And that is where he met Alice. She had come to New York to be a photographer, which meant she was also broke and also going nowhere yet. And she carried the same fear of the dark he had grown up with, except hers had never left. What she did to him is the part that matters. Before Alice, he spent his time alone. She got him out of that, and she pushed him into doing things he would never have chosen for himself, including things that made him look foolish, which, for a man that guarded, is not a small surrender. The covers for his books were hers. So were the promotional photographs. His public face, the image on the back of every novel that made him famous, was produced by his wife. He calls her his muse. That word is going to detonate later in this story, and I want to plant it here so you feel it when it does. Alan Wake is a writer in Bright Falls who describes the woman he loves as his muse. He is not the first. There was another one, 4 decades earlier, standing on the same lake, using the same word about a woman who would go into that water and not come back the way she went in. Nobody warns him. Not one person in that town connects those two facts out loud until it is far too late to matter. The pattern is sitting right there in the local record, in a song that was a regional hit in the 70s, and it takes Alan 4 episodes and a jar of moonshine to hear it. The fame did not agree with him. He grew short-tempered and contemptuous of people in general. Photographers followed him, fans cornered him, and eventually he hit a reporter who would not leave him alone, on camera, in public. The Casey series ended when he killed off his own protagonist because he wanted to write something else. And then he could not write anything at all for 2 years, while the insomnia got worse, and the drinking got worse, and his marriage got worse with them. The people who built him have described him bluntly as unlikable and said they wanted him that way. He hates most people. His marriage is a mess, and a lot of that is his doing. The point of constructing him that way was to avoid the clean-hearted hero, and to make the man at the center of this feel like an actual person with actual failures. That decision pays off in a way most people do not consciously register, and here is where it starts to matter. Alan Wake is a man who was given a tool for surviving the dark, and who then handed that tool to somebody else and walked away from the problem. The light, the one his mother gave him, the one that got him through childhood. He kept it into adulthood, and at some point, as a joke, half affectionate and half dismissive, he gave it to Alice, for when the darkness comes. A cute story between spouses. Here is the thing that fixed me. You take it. Think about what that transfer actually is. He did not throw it away when he outgrew the fear. Instead, he passed it to the person who still had one, framed as a joke, which is a way of doing something kind while making sure nobody has to say out loud that it is being done. That gesture is the whole man in miniature. Real tenderness, delivered at an angle, wrapped in enough irony that he never has to stand behind it. He cannot simply say, "I know you are frightened, and I want you to have this." Making it funny has to come first, and the same instinct is what walks him out of the cabin. He cannot say, "You went behind my back, and it scared me." Everything has to come out as a slammed door. Now the clinical layer briefly, because it is doing real work here. His insomnia is not incidental. Chronic sleep loss has a well-mapped effect on emotional control, and the mechanism is not mysterious. The parts of the brain that generate a threat response become more reactive when sleep is short, while the parts responsible for keeping that response proportionate become less able to intervene. What that produces in practice is a person who goes from irritated to furious faster than they used to, over things that would not have registered a year earlier. Add alcohol on top, which loosens the same brakes from the other direction, and you get a man who is genuinely not in full command of his own reactions. The block itself is worth one honest paragraph too, because it is the pressure underneath everything else in the marriage, and it gets treated as a plot excuse. Alan ended his own series by killing the character it was built on. He did that deliberately, because he wanted to make something new, and because he could feel himself repeating. That is a defensible artistic decision, and also an enormous professional risk, and the moment he took it, he removed the one thing that had reliably worked for him. Then nothing arrived to replace it. 2 years of that does something specific to a person whose identity is fused to their output. The job was never just a job for him. It is the answer he gives when he needs to confirm he still exists. When the work stops, the answer stops being verifiable. And every morning becomes a small, accumulating piece of evidence that the thing he says he is might not be true anymore. People in that state are not merely frustrated. They are in a slow argument with their own name. And they are, without meaning to be, extremely easy to move. Because anyone who can credibly promise to give the work back is holding the only currency that matters to them, which is the offer Alan is going to receive at the bottom of that lake. The offer on the table is a story to write. None of that makes him a villain. Most of it makes him ordinary. Plenty of people are running on 4 hours of sleep and a short fuse and a problem they cannot solve. And they snap at the people closest to them, and they apologize later, and life continues. His snap happens in the one location on Earth where a bad night has consequences that outlive everyone involved. There is one more piece to this chapter, and it is the piece that makes the fear itself worth examining rather than just noting. Watch how the story distributes it. The dark is the enemy, light is the only weapon. The entire mechanic of this world runs on that opposition, and the two people at the center of the marriage have opposite relationships to it. Alice is afraid and stays afraid. Alan was afraid, was given a cure and moved on. So when the darkness finally makes its move, it does not go for the man who thinks he has beaten it. It goes for the woman who never stopped being scared, in a house he just left. At the exact moment the lights die. That is not bad luck. Fear is a foothold. And there was only one person in that cabin who still had one. When Alan hears the scream and runs back in and sees something in the water, he does the one thing he has never had trouble with. He goes in after her. Physical courage he has in abundance. Sitting still in a room and having a difficult conversation is what he cannot do. He dives, the water closes, and a week later he wakes up in a wrecked car with a story already in progress and no memory of writing it. We now know what he was doing during that week. What we do not yet know is why a lake in Washington was in a position to take that offer, or why it needed a writer specifically. Whatever sits in that water has been waiting a very long time, and it has done this before. To a better man, in a worse way. Chapter 4. What the Lake Wants. Go up to the water in the early morning, before anyone is awake, and watch what the wildlife does. Birds fly around the lake instead of over it. Deer come down through the trees, get within a few yards of the shoreline, and stop. Animals in that valley do not drink from Cauldron Lake. They have no theology, and no folklore, and no local legends, and they still will not put their mouths in it. That detail is the most honest description of the place anyone has ever produced, and it does not come from a scientist or a priest. It comes from creatures with no capacity to be superstitious, avoiding a body of water for reasons they cannot explain and do not need to. Here is what the lake actually is, as far as anyone in the story is able to establish. Cauldron Lake sits in the mountains of Washington, in the caldera of a volcano that collapsed in on itself a very long time ago. Water filled the crater. What is left is one of the deepest lakes in the country, ranked among the deepest in that world, with a floor nobody has ever properly surveyed. The volcano underneath is technically still capable of activity, though the last real movement was a series of earthquakes in 1970 that cracked some foundations in town and injured nobody. Hold that year, it comes back. Long before the town of Bright Falls existed, the people living in that region regarded the lake as a gateway to the underworld. That is the phrase the local record preserves. A door in the ground, filled with water, leading down to where the dead are. They were describing something real. The bottom of Cauldron Lake is a worn spot in reality. On the other side of it there is a place, and that place operates on rules that have nothing to do with physics. The dimension underneath goes by a simple name. Everyone who knows about it calls it the dark place. It is not a hell in any moral sense, and nobody in the story treats it as a punishment. What it is, functionally, is a region where thought and imagination have the same solidity that concrete has here. Art made inside it, or made close enough to a threshold that touches it, does not stay art, it becomes true. There are other doorways. An oil spring in the Arizona desert is one. A door in a certain motel is another. Cauldron Lake happens to be the widest and the oldest of the ones we know about, and the town of Bright Falls happens to be built at the edge of it, which means several hundred people have spent their whole lives living next to a hole in the world without being told. The government fenced parts of it off eventually and told everyone it was volcanic gas. That was a lie of the useful kind, the kind that is technically plausible, verifiable enough to survive a local newspaper's attention, and correct about the danger while being wrong about the cause. People stopped hiking there. Whatever was in the water stopped being watched. Now the important part, and the part that determines the entire structure of everything that happens to Alan Wake. Inside the dark place there is something that wants out. It has a name in the story, and the name is deliberately unhelpful. The Dark Presence. Not a species, not a devil, not a god from any recognizable pantheon. A malevolent intelligence that has been down there for an unknown length of time, bound to the lake, unable to reach the surface world on its own power. Understand precisely why it cannot get out, because the limitation is the whole architecture. The Dark Presence has no hands. It cannot build a bridge, dig a tunnel, or force its way through a threshold. The only mechanism available to it for affecting reality is the same mechanism the lake gives to everyone else. It has to make something. and it cannot make anything by itself because it is not a creative intelligence. It has no work of its own, so it has to borrow one. For centuries it has been finding artists near the water and getting inside their process. Painters, musicians, poets, novelists. It bends the work toward its own escape and lets the lake do the rest. Every recorded incident in that valley traces back to somebody who made things for a living being close enough to the shore at the wrong moment. And there is a constraint on top of the constraint, which is the single most interesting piece of world building in this entire story, and the one almost nobody talks about. The presence has to obey the rules of the medium. A painter has to finish the painting. Songs have to be completed by the musicians writing them. A novelist has to finish the novel, and not just any novel, an actual functioning horror story with structure and escalation and internal consistency. It cannot simply have Alan Wake type the sentence, and then the darkness got out and be done. That is not how a book works, and the lake will not honor it, because the lake responds to art rather than to instructions. Think about what that means for a moment. An ancient malevolent intelligence, powerful enough to possess an entire town, is stuck at the bottom of a lake because it cannot get a manuscript past a structural edit. And the reason for the constraint is worth spelling out, because it is not arbitrary. The lake does not respond to wishes. If it responded to wishes, every desperate person who ever stood on that shoreline would have caused a catastrophe, and the town would have been gone in 1880. What the lake responds to is made work, and made work has requirements that a wish does not. A wish is a single sentence with no interior. Stories have to hold together. Things have to follow from other things. The people in it have to behave consistently enough that the whole construction stays standing. So the water demands the one thing that cannot be faked at speed, and the demand functions as a lock. Anyone can want, almost nobody can finish. That is genuinely funny in a way the story never plays for laughs, and underneath the humor it is the reason anybody survives. The presence is bound by craft. It needs a good book, which means it needs a real writer, which means it needs to keep that writer functional and thinking and generating quality material. Reducing him to a puppet the way it reduces the loggers is not available because a puppet cannot write. Whatever it does to him has to leave the part of him that makes decisions about sentences intact, which leaves a door open. A writer who is still capable of making real choices about his own story is a writer who can make a choice the editor did not approve. Hold that. It is going to matter enormously. There is a related detail about how the presence spreads that is worth pinning down because it explains the texture of every night in Bright Falls. It does not only take people. Animals and objects are equally available to it. Flocks of birds come out of the tree line in coordinated masses. A bulldozer starts itself. Oil drums and tractors and roadside furniture lift off the ground and come at a man in the open. Anything with mass in that county can be picked up and thrown, which is why the safest place in Bright Falls at night is not a locked building. It is a working streetlight. That inversion is doing quiet, thematic work throughout the whole story. Shelter, in the ordinary sense, is useless. Walls do not help. The only thing that reliably holds is a circle of illumination in the open air, standing under a lamp in the middle of nowhere with nothing between you and the trees, which is a fairly exact description of what it feels like to be the only person who understands something, not protected by any structure, only by the fact that you can currently see. Now let us talk about why a lake of all things, and why this shape of story keeps recurring outside of Bright Falls entirely. Deep water as an entrance to the land of the dead is not a local invention. Cultures with no contact with each other have independently arrived at the same arrangement, placing the underworld beneath water or across it, guarded by a crossing, rivers you have to be ferried over, wells that go somewhere, lakes that take people and give nothing back. There is a plain reason for the consistency, and it does not require anything mystical. Deep water is the only common environment on Earth that a person can look directly into and cannot survive inside. You can see the surface of it perfectly. A few feet down is still visible. Past that it is opaque, and it stays opaque, and the opacity begins at a depth where you would still be alive. Every other lethal place announces itself. Fire looks like fire. A cliff looks like a cliff. Water looks exactly like something you could step into. So the mind does what it always does with a visible surface concealing an unknown volume. It populates it. And a Cauldron Lake is the most extreme version of that, because the shape of the container is wrong. Ordinary lakes have shallows. They have a beach that eases into deeper water, a slope you can walk down. A crater lake drops. The bottom is not a gradual thing. Stand on the shore, and the floor falls away almost immediately into a column of water hundreds of feet deep, with nothing on the sides. There is a piece of literature that gets closer to Cauldron Lake than anything else I can point at, and it is worth bringing up because it isolates the exact mechanism. There is a well-known science fiction novel, later filmed more than once, about a planet covered entirely by an ocean that turns out to be a single living intelligence. Human researchers orbit it and study it and get nowhere, because the ocean does not communicate in anything they recognize as language. Then it starts reaching into their minds while they sleep, and reproducing what it finds. One of the researchers wakes up to find his wife sitting on the edge of his bed. His wife has been dead for years. She died because of him. The thing that has been assembled in her shape is not cruel and does not attack anybody. It simply is her, more or less, made out of one man's grief and the ocean's total inability to understand what it has done. Consider how precisely that maps. An enormous body of water with an intelligence inside it. No hands, no language, no ability to act on the world except through the contents of a human mind. It reads a wound and manufactures the thing the wound is shaped around. And Alan Wake's last line, the one everybody remembers, is that it is not a lake, it is an ocean. He is not being poetic about the size. What he is doing is correcting a category error the whole town has been making for 150 years. Here is the other thing about how the presence operates, and this is where the analysis stops being about geology and starts being about people. It does not take anything by force from the person who matters. It possesses loggers by force. Birds and deer and machinery and roadside objects go the same way. But the artist at the center of every incident is never simply overpowered. The artist is talked into it, persuaded, comforted, offered something, and then walked step by step into a piece of work they believe is theirs. There is a body of research on coercive control, developed mostly out of studying abusive relationships and high control groups, and one of its most durable findings is that the strongest form of control is never the kind that looks like control. Force produces resistance, and it produces a clear memory of having been forced, which the person can later point at. What lasts is the arrangement where the target does the thing themselves, for reasons they generate themselves, believing throughout that they are exercising judgment. The controlling party's job is not to push. It is to arrange the room so that only one door is comfortable, and then to wait. That is the dark presence exactly, every single time. The old bargain stories understood this too. In the most famous of them, a scholar sells his soul for knowledge and power, and the story is not really about the devil at all. The devil in that story does almost nothing except show up and hold out a pen. What makes it work is that the scholar wants something badly enough to sign, and the signature has to be his, and the contract is void without it. A lake at the bottom of a crater, with something in it that cannot come out until somebody hands it a finished manuscript. That is the same story with the paperwork changed. So when we say the presence wants out, we should be precise about what it actually needs in order to get there. It needs a person with real talent, in genuine pain, close to the water, holding a tool for making things, with a hole in their life exactly the size of the thing the lake can pretend to fill. Alan Wake arrived with all 5 conditions met, and a typewriter already set up in the study. One more feature of the lake, and it is the one that explains why none of this has ever escaped Washington. The power is local. It is tied to the ground. Works made within range of the water can reshape reality, and step outside that range and the effects thin out and stop. A person can drive away from Bright Falls and leave the whole thing behind them. Whatever the lake has done to their life simply lifts, the way a fever lifts. That containment is why the dark presence is so desperate, rather than merely patient. It is not sitting in the dark, biding its time with all the leisure in the world. Something has it pinned inside a radius, and that radius has held for as long as it has existed, and every artist who wanders into range is a lottery ticket. Most of them produce nothing usable. A few produce something. One of them, eventually, will produce a finished book. Meanwhile, the town holds a deer festival every year. Banners on the main street, a pageant, families on the sidewalk, several hundred people living their entire lives inside the radius of a hole in the world, celebrating the season directly above it, because nobody has ever told them, and the 2 or 3 residents who know have no way to say it that would not get them committed. He was not the first. 40 years earlier, a better man than him walked into the same arrangement with the same equipment and made a choice that has never stopped costing this town anything. And everything that happens to Alan is a rerun of what happened to that man, with the volume turned up. Chapter 5. The Poet and His Muse. Start in 1970, on the 10th of July. A woman goes swimming in Cauldron Lake in the morning and does not come out. Her name is Barbara Jagger. She is 23 years old. Understand who is being lost here, because the story usually introduces her as a monster and works backward, and doing it in that order flattens her into a plot device. Barbara Jagger grew up in Bright Falls, not an outsider, not a mystery, not a stranger who arrived with the poet. A local woman who had lived there her whole life and was widely liked, known around town for being kind and for being generous and for being extremely beautiful. She won the Deerfest pageant 3 separate times. Community events got her baking, and she was, in the smallest and most literal sense of the phrase, the town's favorite person, and she was drowned in the town's lake before she turned 26. A few years before that, a poet came to Bright Falls. Thomas Zane was successful and respected and, by every description that survives, deeply unhappy, not tortured in the marketable way, unhappy in the flat grinding way, the kind that has been there long enough that the person stops expecting it to lift. He came to the mountains looking for something to write about, which is the same errand Alan Wake will run 4 decades later, and he took a cabin out on a small island in the middle of the lake. The island got named Diver's Isle because Zane dove constantly. He would go down into that water for hours, alone, in a suit and a helmet, in a lake that has no measured bottom. His pleasure in life was descending into a hole in the world and looking around. The cabin on that island is called Bird Leg Cabin. Same cabin, same island. Alice Wake will set up a typewriter in that building in September of 2010. In the same room, facing the same water. Zane met Barbara and something in him changed almost immediately. Every account of it says the same thing in different words. He had never been a happy man, and without appearing to try, she made him one. Poems about her started arriving. A great deal about her. And he called her his muse. I planted that word in the last chapter, and here is where it earns its place. Because the way Zane used it is the way Alan Wake uses it. And it is worth being honest about what the word actually does to a person. Calling someone a muse is presented, socially, as the highest compliment an artist can pay. Underneath the compliment, there is a conversion happening. A muse is not a person with her own interior weather, and her own bad days, and her own reasons for being tired. What a muse is, functionally, is an input. She is the thing that makes the work possible, valued in direct proportion to the work she enables, and the compliment quietly relocates her from the category of people to the category of conditions. Barbara Jagger was a woman with a life in that town. Zane loved her genuinely, and the record on that is not ambiguous. He also, in the same breath, described her as the reason he could produce. 2 things can be true. What matters is which of the 2 he reaches for when she is gone. There is a small biographical detail about her that I keep coming back to, and it is the pageant. She won the Deerfest title 3 separate times. That is a specific kind of local fame. It means she was, by public vote, the face of that town's annual celebration of itself, repeatedly, over several years. Bright Falls looked at Barbara Jagger and saw the best version of what it was, which means when the dark presence takes her body and walks around in it for the next 40 years, it is not merely wearing a corpse. It is wearing the town's self-image, the thing that hands Alan Wake his cabin keys in a diner full of tourists, is Bright Falls dressed as itself, in mourning clothes, in July. Also living on that island, or close enough to it, was a young man Zane employed as an assistant, Bobby Radcliffe. Keep him in your peripheral vision for the whole of this chapter. He does not appear to do much. In practice, he is doing almost everything. And in town there was a local newspaper reporter named Cynthia Weaver, who knew both of them and who was quietly in love with the poet, and never said so to anyone. That detail will not seem important for another 2 chapters. It is important now. Zane worked out what the lake could do. Given the amount of time he spent in it, that was probably inevitable. He noticed that what he wrote on that island did not stay on the page, and the noticing frightened him badly enough that he considered stopping altogether. He talked to his assistant about stopping. His assistant talked him out of it. That is the hinge of the entire 40 years that follow, and it happens in a conversation nobody recorded, between a frightened artist and a young man who had just realized what he was standing next to. Zane wanted to put the tool down. Radcliffe explained why he should keep going. Then, on a July morning, Barbara went into the water and did not come back. The circumstances have never been fully explained. There is a version preserved in a song where he told her about a treasure at the bottom of the lake, and she went looking for it out of curiosity and drowned. The plain record simply says she drowned in Cauldron Lake at 25, and that is where the certainty ends. Nobody in that town knows exactly why she went in. Zane went in after her. He put on the diving suit and went down into the lake he loved, looking for the woman he loved, in water with no bottom, and he came back up before dark with nothing. Take a breath here, because what happens next is the moral center of this entire story, and it deserves to be understood as a human event before it becomes a supernatural one. Grief researchers have spent decades mapping what actually happens to a person in the first weeks after a sudden loss, and one of the most consistent findings is that the bereaved person searches, not metaphorically, literally. People report catching sight of the dead in crowds, hearing them in the next room, reaching for the phone to call them, and setting out a second cup. A significant proportion of widowed people report a clear sense of the presence of their spouse, and this is not treated as pathology. It is a normal feature of early grief, and the current understanding is that it happens because attachment is built out of a set of automatic behaviors that were tuned over years to locate one specific person, and those behaviors do not switch off when the person stops existing. The search program keeps running with nothing to find. Ordinarily, that is the end of it. The searching burns itself out over months, painfully, and the person adjusts. Thomas Zane's search had somewhere to go. He was a writer, standing on the one piece of ground on earth where writing becomes fact, holding an unbearable amount of grief, and his assistant told him that he could simply put her back. He wrote her back. The mechanics of that sentence deserve more discomfort than they usually get. He sat down at a desk and composed, in language, the return of a specific dead woman, and he did it well enough that the lake accepted it. There is no scene of him hesitating that survives in any form. Most likely reading is that he did not hesitate for long, because a man in the third week of that kind of grief, handed that specific power, is not making a decision in any meaningful sense. He is being carried, and it worked. Something came back out of Cauldron Lake wearing Barbara Jagger's face and body, and it was not Barbara Jagger. The dark presence took the opening the poem created, filled the shape he had written, and walked ashore in the skin of the most loved woman in town. Now the reason this lands as hard as it does, and the reason it is not merely a spooky idea, is that this exact story has been told repeatedly for as long as people have been telling stories, and it is always told as a warning about the same thing. The oldest and most famous version is the poet, who goes down into the underworld after his dead wife. He is a musician, and his music is so good that the rulers of the dead agree to let her go, on one condition. The walkout has to be done with her behind him and his eyes forward, no looking back until they both reach the surface. He nearly makes it. Near the exit, he cannot stand not knowing whether she is really behind him, and he turns, and she is gone for good. That story next to this one, and the parallel is uncomfortable. An artist whose work is powerful enough to negotiate with death, who gets a conditional yes, and who loses everything at the final step. Zane's condition was not about looking back. His condition was that whatever came back would come back through a door that something else was standing behind. Then there is the pair of stories that specifically govern what returns. One is a short story, barely a few pages, about a family given 3 wishes by a cursed object. Their son dies in an industrial accident. The mother wishes him back. Something begins knocking at the door in the middle of the night, and the father, who has understood what is actually coming up the road, uses the last wish to send it away before his wife can open it. The other is a novel about a family who buries a cat in old ground behind their house and gets it back wrong, and then buries a child there. Both stories are built on one insight, and it is the same insight the poet's story is built on, and it is the insight Cauldron Lake makes literal. Grief will take any offer. It does not evaluate the terms. A person in the first month of losing someone will accept a deal with no readable text on it. And the fact that they can be so easily persuaded to accept is not a character flaw. It is what love looks like when the thing it was pointed at is gone. The lake did not deceive Thomas Zane. It gave him precisely what he asked for. He asked for a shape, and it filled the shape, and it was never in a position to supply the contents because the contents were a person, and the person was dead. Something in him eventually understood. We do not have a clean account of the moment. What we have is what he did afterward, and what he did afterward is the most extreme corrective act in this entire story. He used the lake to erase himself, not to fight the thing he had released. No attempt to trap it, or bargain with it, or warn the town. He wrote himself out of existence, along with the island and everything involved. In the account preserved from the first telling of these events, the poet put on the diving suit and let himself sink into Cauldron Lake, to be with the woman who drowned there, and did not surface. Both descriptions arrive at the same practical outcome. Thomas Zane stops being a person in 1970, by his own hand, in the water he loved, because he could not think of another way to undo what he had made. 2 things must be said about that. The first is that it did not work. Barbara's body stayed with the presence for 40 more years, and it was still wearing her when it handed Alan Wake a set of cabin keys in a diner. The second is that it partly did. Something of Zane persisted, in a form the story never fully explains, and that persistent something spends the rest of this narrative trying to help. There are contradictory accounts of who and what he was, and those accounts have shifted with each new telling of the wider history. One version has him as a poet and diver. Another has him as a filmmaker who once played a poet and diver in a lost film. The record does not resolve, and I am not going to pretend it does, because the honest position is that Bright Falls has more than one incompatible story about Thomas Zane, and no way to test which is true. One account that circulates in the wider record adds a detail I will pass along with the label it deserves, which is that it is one account among several and not confirmed anywhere else. In that version, Zane did not simply delete himself and Barbara. He wrote a small separate world for the 2 of them, somewhere inside the dark place, and put their spirits there to live quietly, while the 2 opposing forces took their emptied bodies and used them as faces to continue an argument that had been going on long before either of them was born. Whether or not that is true, and I do not know that it is, notice what the story is reaching for. Even the most generous version of Thomas Zane's ending is a version where he gets to be with her only by leaving the world entirely, and only as an idea, while something else walks around in his shape doing things he would not have chosen. What is consistent across every version is the shape of what he did. A man made something out of grief. The something turned out to be a door, and he destroyed himself trying to shut it. And here is where he connects to the thread running through all of this. Thomas Zane is the first person in this story to wake up. He is the first one to see the actual situation clearly, without comfort and without a story wrapped around it. Looking at the woman he had brought back, he understood what she was, and understood that he had done it, and understood that no amount of further writing would undo it cleanly, and his reward for that clarity was total. He does not get to leave. Warning anyone is not available to him. There is no proper grieving, no explaining himself, no being remembered accurately. The moment he woke up, the only move left to him was to write himself off the board, and even that only half worked. Nobody in this valley wakes up and walks away. Zane established the pattern in 1970, and everyone who follows him is repeating it. The town does not remember any of this correctly. What the town has is a rock song from 1976 about a poet and his muse and a magic lake, which is not history and does not present itself as history, and which is nonetheless the most accurate surviving account of the worst thing that ever happened in that county. And the one man who was in the room for all of it, who talked Zane out of stopping, who watched what the lake did to a dead woman and took notes, did not erase himself. He bought a hotel. Chapter 6. The Assistant Who Kept Notes. Picture the building. The Cauldron Lake Lodge was put up around 1970 as a hotel, in the heavy timbered style of that period, and it sits on the ridge above the water with a view down over the whole lake. Locals call it the Cauldron Lake Lodge. It is closed to the public except for tours on Saturdays. Inside, the hallways are quiet in the specific way that institutional hallways are quiet, and the patients are all artists, painters, writers, musicians, people who made things for a living and then stopped being able to. The doctor who owns it wrote a book called The Creator's Dilemma, which sold extremely well and made him a recognized authority on exactly this problem. His pitch is that he does not use formulas. No 12 steps, no program, no method applied uniformly to everybody. Each patient gets an approach designed for them personally, and the approach almost always involves self-expression. Paint, write, play, make something. He puts blocked artists on a ridge above Cauldron Lake and prescribes making things. Emil Hartman had been standing next to this for 40 years. He was the young man in the room when Thomas Zane figured out what the water could do. A poem raised the dead in front of him. When Zane got frightened and wanted to stop, Hartman was the voice that said, "Keep going." And after Zane erased himself, Hartman did not report anything, did not warn anyone, and did not leave. He built a facility on the ridge and started collecting. Let us be precise about what the clinic actually is, because the story states it plainly, and it is easy to hear as a generic evil doctor arrangement when it is considerably more specific than that. Hartman is not treating these people. He is using them as instruments for measuring and eventually controlling the lake. Every patient is a test. The paintings and the manuscripts produced in that building are not therapy. They are attempts to find out what the water will accept and from whom. He wanted to know whether the power could be harnessed and pointed, and he needed a steady supply of creative minds within range to find out. The goal, in his own framing, was something close to a utopia. He believed the creative energy of that place could be organized into something extraordinary if the right person managed it. That is the part that makes him more interesting than a straightforward villain, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Hartman is not doing this for money, or not primarily. He is doing it because he saw a miracle once, as a young man, and spent his whole life unable to accept that the correct response to that miracle was to walk away from it. Now the clinical layer, because this is where the chapter stops being about a fictional psychiatrist. The relationship between a therapist and a patient is unusual among professional relationships, and the reason is asymmetry. Patients arrive having agreed in advance to say true things about themselves that they do not say anywhere else. To do that, they have to grant the clinician a level of interpretive authority over their own inner life that they would not grant to a friend, a spouse, or a stranger. When the patient says, "I think I might be losing my mind," and the clinician says no, this is anxiety, and here is why. The patient is expected to update. That is the entire mechanism. It only functions if the person in the chair has no competing interest in the answer. The professional literature calls the failure mode a dual relationship. and the ethical rules around it are strict for a straightforward reason. Once a clinician stands to gain something from a particular outcome, every single thing they say to the patient becomes untrustworthy, including the things that happen to be true. That patient has no way to sort the accurate observations from the motivated ones, because the entire arrangement was built on not having to sort. Hartman's competing interest is not a lapse. It is the reason the building exists. Watch how that plays out on the Anderson brothers. Odin and Tor Anderson are two elderly men living in that clinic. They were rock musicians, genuinely successful for about a decade in the 70s, and they are now in serious cognitive decline. Between them, they also know more about the dark presence than anybody else alive in that valley, because they encountered it directly when they were young and they survived it, which nobody else can claim. They left a message for whoever would eventually need it, hidden in a song, on a record, at their farm. By the time Alan Wake meets them, they cannot remember where it is. They know a message exists. Its importance is clear to them. Retrieving the location is the part that fails, and the reason given for that in the story is not only their dementia. Both men are heavily medicated, and the medication is Hartman's. Sit with the shape of that for a second, separate from the supernatural framing. An institution is holding the two people who possess the critical information. Those two people are cognitively impaired. The institution has them sedated. Administering that sedation is the person who benefits most from that information never surfacing, and every element of it is defensible on paper, because they are elderly, and they are unwell, and they say things that sound like nonsense, and the medication has a legitimate clinical justification. Real institutional care has a long and thoroughly documented history with this exact pattern. Oversedation of elderly residents, particularly those with dementia, has been the subject of decades of regulatory attention across multiple countries, and the recurring finding is rarely deliberate cruelty. What investigators tend to find is that sedation solves a staffing problem. A quiet resident requires less labor than an agitated one. The drug is prescribed for a real symptom. The dose creeps, nobody in the building has any incentive to reduce it, and the patient becomes progressively less able to advocate for themselves, which makes the arrangement more stable rather than less. Now add a director who actively wants two specific patients to stay incoherent, and you have the Andersons, the thing that makes them heroic, and they are the closest thing this story has to heroes, is that they anticipated exactly this. They knew their minds were going, so they encoded the message somewhere their own decline could not reach, in a piece of art recorded decades earlier, which does not degrade when the people who made it do. More on that when we get to the farm. Return to Hartman. There are other patients in that building, and they are worth naming, because they demonstrate what the clinic is for more clearly than anything the doctor says about himself. One of them is a painter who spends his time compulsively producing canvases, driven to it, unable to stop. Others are simply there, sedated, quiet, occupying rooms in a facility described in its own promotional material as a place that gives you the specified help you need. Tours run on Saturdays for anyone curious enough to drive up. Members of the public walk those halls, look at the view over the lake, and go home impressed. That last part deserves a moment. The most effective cover a harmful institution can have is not secrecy, it is a public tour. A locked building invites questions. One that opens its doors on a schedule, shows you the pleasant common rooms, and lets you leave with a brochure has purchased something far more valuable than privacy. It has purchased dozens of ordinary townspeople who will say, honestly and from personal experience, that they have been inside and it seemed fine. The clinic did not only hold patients. Hartman kept a private art collection, described as one of the largest gatherings of bizarre and unsettling art anywhere, and he kept it on the premises. Consider what that collection actually is, given everything we know about him. He is a man who studies what art does to reality, in a place where art does things to reality, and he privately accumulates the strangest art he can find. Those are not the habits of a doctor. They are the habits of a collector building an inventory of possible tools. And then there is Ben Mott. Mott is a local man working for Hartman. When Alan surfaces in Bright Falls after the missing week, Mott contacts him and claims to have taken Alice. He demands a ransom. The ransom is not money, it is the manuscript. Take a moment on that, because it is the clearest possible statement of what Hartman actually wants. A famous novelist's wife has vanished. The man who has been trying to get that novelist near the lake for months sends an associate to pose as a kidnapper, and the associate asks for the pages. Hartman does not want Alan cured. He does not want Alice found. What he wants is the manuscript in his possession complete, because a complete manuscript written on that lake is the most powerful object anyone in that valley has ever produced, and he has spent 40 years waiting for one. The cruelty of the fake ransom is worth naming plainly. Alan Wake spends days believing his wife is alive and held by a person who might release her. That belief is the only thing keeping him upright. It is a fabrication, constructed by a doctor, to make a grieving man produce pages faster. And when Alan finally reaches the top of Mirror Peak to make the exchange, he finds Mott on his knees, terrified, having realized what he has actually been standing next to. The kidnapper never had Alice. He never could have. Running an errand for a psychiatrist was the whole of his involvement, and he had no idea what the errand was attached to. And the dark presence removes him from the story within about a minute of Alan's arrival, which brings us to the lodge itself, and the scene that makes Hartman genuinely frightening rather than simply corrupt. Alan goes off Mirror Peak into the lake and is pulled out of the water. He wakes up in a bed in the Cauldron Lake Lodge, sedated, with Emil Hartman sitting nearby. And Hartman tells him, kindly and professionally, that Alice drowned days ago, that everything Alan believes he has experienced since then, the pages and the shadows and the man with the axe, is a delusion generated by a mind refusing to process a death. Alan has been a patient here all along, apparently, and the doctor has been trying to help him. Every part of that is a lie, and Hartman knows it is a lie. And Hartman knows the lie is also the most plausible thing anyone in that room could say. That is the hardest kind of manipulation to survive. It is not an outlandish claim that a person can reject on the evidence. Any reasonable outside observer would independently arrive at exactly that version of events. A man with a documented history of insomnia and substance problems, whose wife just drowned in front of him, who lost a week, who has been running around a small town at night shooting at people and collecting pages that describe the future. Put that file in front of 100 clinicians, and 100 of them will say the same thing Hartman says. The story is doing something genuinely clever here. It has constructed a scenario in which the correct psychiatric interpretation and the deliberate malicious lie are word for word identical. There is a whole tradition of films built on this exact tension. One of the earliest and most influential horror films ever made is about an asylum director who turns out to be a patient himself, told from the point of view of a man everyone insists is mad. A more recent and widely seen thriller drops an investigator onto an island institution where the staff calmly explain that his entire investigation is a delusion they have been humoring, and the film spends 2 hours refusing to tell you which side is lying. Both of those work because the audience is placed in exactly Alan's position. You cannot verify anything. The only people with access to the records are the people you suspect. Bright Falls adds one turn that neither of those has. Hartman is lying, and Hartman is also the only person in that building who fully understands what is really happening, and he is using an accurate description of mental illness as camouflage for supernatural knowledge. Alan does not believe him. He decides to play along, which is the smartest thing he does in the entire story, and he uses the lodge tour to work out the layout of the building. That night, the Andersons cause a disturbance. Alan gets into Hartman's office and finds every manuscript page he had collected, sitting on the doctor's desk. He finds Barry locked in a room, and then the lake reaches up and takes the lodge apart. The dark presence comes for the clinic directly, and the building is consumed, and the patients get out because 2 old men with dementia lead them out. Everything Emil Hartman built across 4 decades stops functioning in a single night. His story continues past this point in ways that reach outside this valley entirely, and it goes somewhere considerably worse for him than anyone in that building could have predicted. That is a thread for another night. What matters here is what he leaves behind. Hartman is the one character in this story who never wakes up. He sees the truth in 1960, at the beginning, before anyone else, and instead of being changed by it, he converts it into a business plan. 40 years of proximity to a hole in the world, and his conclusion is that he should acquire real estate near it. And because he never wakes up, he is the only one who gets to keep going for 4 decades without paying anything. The book he wrote is part of that. His Creator's Dilemma is a genuine bestseller in that world. Respected, widely read, the reason Alice found him in the first place. A man who has spent his life quietly harvesting artists is also the most trusted public voice on what artists need. There is nothing supernatural about that combination, and it is the most common way harm gets institutionalized. Expertise is granted on the basis of output, and output is easy to produce when you have unlimited access to the population you are writing about. Hartman had 4 decades of case material that nobody else on Earth could have gathered, because nobody else on Earth was willing to gather it that way. The quality of his observations is real. What produced them is the crime. So the book is good, and the book is honest about creative paralysis, and the book works as advertised for the thousands of ordinary readers who will never come within 500 miles of Cauldron Lake. It functions perfectly as a piece of writing, and perfectly as a net, and there was never a moment where those two functions came into conflict, which is precisely why nobody caught him. That is not a comforting observation, and I am not going to soften it. In this story, the people who understand what is happening lose everything, and the man who refuses to let the understanding change him prospers for 40 years. Clarity is punished here. Willful blindness gets a lodge with a view, which sets up the question underneath the next stretch of this, because Alan Wake is now holding a stack of pages that describe his own immediate future, and the pages are not a warning, they are an instrument. And the question of who is actually operating it has a very unsettling answer. Chapter 7. Pages written in advance. There is a page nailed to a tree. Alan finds it with a flashlight, in the woods, and it describes a man finding a page nailed to a tree in the woods. And then it describes what happens to that man 90 seconds later. He reads it, then it happens, exactly as written, including details he could not have caused. We need to be very clear about what this object is, because the story keeps handing it to you in fragments, and it takes a long time to see the whole thing. The manuscript is called Departure. Alan wrote it in Bird Leg Cabin during the week he cannot remember. He wrote it because Barbara Jagger, or the thing using her, sat him down after Alice went into the water and told him that Cauldron Lake is a special place, and that if he wrote her a story she could bring Alice back. She served as his editor. That word is doing an extraordinary amount of work, and the story never draws attention to it. Not his captor, nothing so blunt as his master, his editor. She sat with him and shaped the manuscript, and what she shaped it toward was a version of events in which the darkness grows enormous and kills everyone in Bright Falls, because that is the story that ends with her getting out. Alan wrote it. He was hypnotized, grieving, and lied to, and he still physically produced every word, and at some point during that week, he worked out what was being done to him. This is the single most important thing Alan Wake ever does, and it happens entirely off-screen, before the game you play even begins. He realized that the book he was writing was a door for the thing standing over his shoulder. Stopping was not available to him, because he was not in control of that. What he could do was write, so he wrote Thomas Zane into the story. He put the poet into his own manuscript as a figure of light, arriving later to interrupt him before he could finish. And because the lake honors what is written, Zane arrived. He broke Alan out of the hypnosis, gave him a window to get to a car, and took the pages. That is why the manuscript is scattered across the county, and why it is unfinished. Alan Wake sabotaged his own book from inside the sentence he was writing, using the only tool he had, which was the fact that he is a professional, and the thing controlling him needed him to remain one. Sit with the sheer strangeness of that. The dark presence could not do this itself. It needed craft, and craft requires judgment, and judgment cannot be safely disabled without destroying the thing it needs. so it had to leave the writer's hands on the wheel, and the writer used them. An unfinished manuscript is now the only thing standing between Bright Falls and the end of Bright Falls. Every night that Alan does not complete Departure is a night the darkness stays in the water. His block, the thing that has been humiliating him for 2 years, is functionally a defense system. Now let us deal with the pages themselves as an experience, because what they do to Alan is worth examining independently of what they do to the plot. Foreknowledge is generally good for a person. Research on stress and control has been consistent for a long time that predictability reduces the physiological cost of a threat. Knowing that a painful thing is coming, and roughly when, allows a person to prepare, and preparation is calming even when it does not change the outcome. That effect depends entirely on one variable. The person has to be able to do something. Strip the ability to act, and the relationship inverts hard. A body that knows what is coming and cannot affect it enters a state that the older experimental literature described as learned helplessness. Repeated exposure to unavoidable negative events produces an animal, or a person, who stops attempting to escape even after escape becomes possible. The mechanism is not stupidity. It is an accurate inference. Something has learned, correctly, that its actions do not connect to its outcomes, and it updates accordingly. Alan's pages sit precisely on that line, and they are calibrated to keep him there. He knows what is coming. Preventing it is rarely possible. Occasionally a page gives him something actionable, which is exactly enough to prevent him from concluding that the pages are useless. Everything else is advance notice of harm he will absorb regardless. That mixture, unpredictable reward embedded in mostly uncontrollable outcomes, is the most behaviorally sticky arrangement anyone has ever identified. It is the reason slot machines work, and the reason people keep refreshing things. Intermittent payoff produces more persistent behavior than reliable payoff does. And Alan Wake keeps picking up pages for the same reason anyone keeps pulling a lever. By the halfway point of his ordeal, he is no longer using the pages as information. He is using them as reassurance that the story he is in has an author, which is preferable to the alternative. Then there is the question the pages force, and it is the oldest question in narrative. Is Alan choosing anything? The manuscript describes his actions before he takes them. His actions match. He is following pages that predict him following pages. From the outside, that looks like a man on rails. The classical version of this problem is a play about a king who is told at birth that he will kill his father and marry his mother. Everyone involved takes drastic action to prevent it. The prevention is the mechanism. Sending the child away means he grows up not knowing his parents, which is the only condition under which the prophecy could possibly be fulfilled. Nothing about it overpowers anyone. It works through the completely free choices of people trying to avoid it. Alan's situation runs on a variation of that engine, with one difference that matters enormously. He wrote it. The prophecy in the old play comes from outside, from an oracle, from gods with their own agenda. What happened in Bright Falls came out of Alan Wake's own typewriter under the supervision of an editor, which means the question of whether he has free will has an answer, and the answer is yes, in the worst possible way. He is not being forced to follow somebody else's plot. Instead, he is being held to his own. That is a much stranger and more humiliating trap than fate. Fate at least lets you resent something external. Alan Wake is trapped inside a well-constructed narrative because he is a good enough writer to have constructed it well. His competence is the cage. Every instinct he trained over 6 novels, every reflex for making a scene pay off and a setup land and a chase escalate properly, is now load-bearing architecture in a building he cannot leave. This is where I want to bring in some outside company, because the pattern Alan is caught in has an entire small tradition around it, and seeing the neighbors helps clarify what makes this version distinct. One of the most obvious ancestors is a novel by an extremely famous horror author about a writer who invents a violent pseudonym, publishes 4 books under that name, and then decides to retire the persona publicly. The persona does not accept retirement. It climbs out and starts killing people, and it looks like the author, and it wants its career back. Alan Wake carries a great deal of that story's genetics. and the resemblance becomes almost uncomfortable once you know what walks out of the lake at the end of this one. The same author also wrote a novel about a writer who retreats to a lake house in the woods after his wife's death and finds that the place is inhabited, and another about a writer trapped by a reader who insists on controlling the ending, and another about a man who ended a beloved series by killing off the main character. Alan Wake ended a beloved series by killing off the main character, and the connection there has been noted often enough that it is fair to call it deliberate homage rather than coincidence. Then there is a film about an insurance investigator sent to find a missing horror novelist who gradually discovers that the novelist's unpublished book is rewriting the world and that he himself is a character in it. The investigator's problem is identical to Alan's. Every attempt to escape the plot is already in the plot. The last shot of that film is the man sitting alone in a cinema, watching the film of his own life, laughing, because there is nothing else available to do. And underneath all of it there is a small-town Pacific Northwest atmosphere that anyone who has watched a certain early 90s television series will recognize instantly. Damp forests, a diner that matters, a friendly sheriff, a community with a pleasant surface and a supernatural wound underneath, and an outsider investigator who is charmed by the place while it slowly eats him. Bright Falls is standing on that ground consciously, and it does not pretend otherwise. The festival, the radio host, the local characters who are all slightly too vivid, the sense that the town itself is aware of you. What Bright Falls adds to that inheritance is the manuscript. None of those earlier stories put the pages in the protagonist's hands. The writer in the pseudonym novel does not get to read what happens next. No script is handed to the investigator in the film. They are inside stories they cannot see. Alan can see his. That is the innovation, and it is what turns the whole thing from a story about a man trapped in fiction into a story about authorship as a condition. There is one more piece of the fiction that comments on itself, and it lives inside the world rather than outside it. Bright Falls has a television show, an anthology series about strange events in a town where the ordinary rules do not apply, the kind of program that runs late at night and opens with a narrator explaining that you have crossed into somewhere unusual. Alan wrote for it early in his career. That is a small biographical detail with an enormous shadow. Before he was famous, before the crime novels, Alan Wake wrote episodes of a show about people stumbling into places where reality has gone soft. Then he stumbled into one. And the anthology format matters, because an anthology is a structure with no continuity and no consequences. Every episode resets. Nobody carries anything forward. Whatever happened last week to whoever it happened to is gone, and a fresh victim walks into a fresh town with no memory of the last one. Keep that structure in mind for the end of this. It is going to describe something. There is one more layer of recursion worth mentioning, and it is a real-world one. The studio that made this game had, years earlier, made a series about a New York detective trapped inside hard-boiled crime narration, constantly describing his own life in noir metaphor as it fell apart. Book titles in Alan Wake's crime series are lifted directly from that earlier work. Chapter names from the life of a fictional detective become the titles of novels written by a fictional novelist in a game about a writer whose fiction becomes real. That is not a hidden secret. It is sitting on a bookshelf in the game where anyone can read it, and it means the recursion in this story goes one level higher than the story itself, into the history of the people who made it, who have been telling versions of this same thought for a very long time. Before we leave the pages, there is one person in this story who exists specifically to demonstrate what the manuscript does to somebody who is not an artist, and he tends to get remembered as comic relief. Barry Wheeler is Alan's agent and has been his closest friend since long before either of them was successful. He is loud, he is anxious, he wears a string of Christmas lights around his body for most of the back half of this ordeal, and he is the only major character in Bright Falls who makes nothing. Watch what the darkness does with him. Nothing. It cannot use him. Barry is chased, terrified, nearly killed several times, and never once is he possessed, never once is he recruited, never once does anything reach into his head and offer him a deal. He has no work for it to bend. He is the control group, and the story puts him on screen for hours, so you can see the difference. The talent that makes Alan valuable is the same property that makes him vulnerable, and the proof is standing right next to him in a sweater, screaming, completely safe from the one thing everybody else in this town is not safe from. So where does that leave Alan practically in the middle of his own book? He has a manuscript he wrote and does not remember. There is a publisher who wants him dead once he is finished, and he has a light and a gun and a town full of people who used to be neighbors. On top of all that, he has the one advantage the whole architecture guarantees him, which is that nothing can take the pen out of his hand without losing the thing it needs. He is going to use that advantage. It is going to cost him more than he understands. And before he gets there, he is going to be hunted across that town by a man who never read a single page, and who arrived at the truth on his own, through nothing but grief and a series of dreams, which is a worse way to learn it than any of the others. Chapter 8. The Agent Who Dreamed Him. There is a moment in a radio station where a man puts a gun through a window and fires into a room with two people in it. He is not aiming to arrest anybody at that point. The station's host is at the microphone, mid-broadcast, and has just mentioned on air that Alan Wake has walked in. That shot shatters the booth glass and hits neither of them. Then the shooter shouts that he will catch Alan if it kills him. His name is Robert Nightingale, and he is an FBI agent, and he is not an FBI agent anymore, and understanding the gap between those two facts is the whole of this chapter. Start where he started. Nightingale was good, not adequate, genuinely, notably good. He and his partner were known well enough for their conduct to have earned a nickname around the bureau, and the nickname was the kind you get for being upright. Two agents with clean records and a reputation for doing things correctly. His partner's name was Finn. At some point Finn began talking about darkness, not metaphorically. He started avoiding shadows, deliberately, in a way his partner could see. Attempts to explain what he was worried about would have sounded exactly as unhinged as this sounds written down. Nightingale told him to get his act together. Hear that in the voice of a decent man with a partner he respects, who has started behaving strangely. It is not a cruel response. Standard, in fact. Almost everyone says it, in almost every profession, to a colleague who begins saying things that cannot be true. Get it together. Take some leave. You are not making sense. Then Finn was taken. Not killed in a way anyone could file. Taken under circumstances the record calls unclear and probably paranatural, which is the bureaucratic way of saying that something happened to a federal agent that nobody has ever been able to describe, and Robert Nightingale was left holding the specific piece of knowledge that his partner had tried to warn him, and he had told him to stop talking. He started drinking. It got bad enough that the bureau discharged him, and somewhere in that collapse he began having nightmares. And in the nightmares there was a man, and the man looked very much like the novelist Alan Wake. He was not the only person having those dreams. At least one other person, hundreds of miles away, with no connection to any of this, was dreaming about the same writer and eventually wrote a book trying to understand why. Something about Alan Wake was leaking into the sleep of strangers before Alan Wake ever arrived in Bright Falls, and neither the story nor anyone in it ever explains the mechanism. It is simply true and left unexplained, and I am not going to invent a reason for it. What Nightingale did with those dreams is the tragedy. He concluded that the man in them was responsible. Exactly how he got from a recurring face to a criminal accusation is never laid out, and there is no document in this story that walks through his reasoning. What is clear is the outcome. A discharged, alcoholic former federal agent decided that a famous novelist had killed his partner and traveled to Washington to arrest him, or to kill him, with no evidence, no authority, and a badge he was no longer entitled to carry. Now the analysis, and this is a chapter where the real-world framework is doing more explanatory work than the supernatural one. What happened to Nightingale after Finn is not adequately described as trauma. There is a more precise concept. developed initially out of work with military personnel and later extended to medical staff and first responders, called moral injury. It is distinguished from post-traumatic stress by its content. Post-traumatic stress is fundamentally a fear disorder. Something threatened your life and your threat system never stood down. Moral injury is not about fear at all. It is the damage caused by having done, failed to do, or witnessed something that violates your own moral code. The symptoms overlap, which is why it took so long to separate them. What distinguishes moral injury is the emotional signature. Fear-based conditions produce hypervigilance, avoidance, and startle. Moral injury produces guilt, shame, self-condemnation, and a collapse in the person's sense of being a good person, which is a much harder thing to treat, because the person is not misperceiving a threat. They are correctly remembering something they did. Robert Nightingale's core memory is that his partner asked for help and he refused it, and then his partner was destroyed by the exact thing he had been trying to describe. Every single behavior Nightingale exhibits afterward follows from that with a kind of grim logic. The drinking is the most common self-medication for that specific injury, and it is well documented in the populations where moral injury is most studied. Alcohol is unusually effective at temporarily interrupting self-directed rumination, which is the dominant symptom. The obsession follows too. Guilt of that intensity requires somewhere to go. It has two available destinations. Staying pointed at the self is one of them, which is unsurvivable at that dose. The other is redirection onto an external party who can be blamed and pursued and eventually punished. Redirection is not a conscious decision. It is what a mind does to avoid dissolving. So Nightingale needed a guilty party who was not himself, and his dreams handed him a face, and now the detail that lifts this from a sad story into something genuinely disturbing. He was right, not about Alan, about everything else. Finn was not having a breakdown. The darkness Finn was trying to describe is real, is in that lake, and does take people. Nightingale's underlying conviction, the thing that got him discharged and ridiculed and left him screaming at a novelist in a radio station, is factually correct. He is the only person in this story who arrives at the truth without any assistance. No manuscript pages, nothing from a song recorded in 1976, no poet whispering to him from the light. He got there through guilt and dreams and a partner's death, and he was closer to reality than almost anyone in Bright Falls. Being right about the world and wrong about one person is the most destructive combination available to a human being. A person who is wrong about everything gets corrected eventually. Somebody who is right about the terrain and wrong about the target has all the energy of accurate conviction pointed at the wrong coordinates, and no argument works on them, because every argument attacks the part they can verify. Nobody can talk Nightingale down, and this is the part where the town's institutions come into it. It is worth pausing to notice that Bright Falls is, on the evidence, a decent place, not a town of collaborators. Nothing about it suggests a community hiding something. The sheriff is good at her job and openly protective of a man she has no reason to protect. Over at the station, the radio host stays on the air through a supernatural emergency, calmly reading out where the power is still working, because that is what a local station is for. Deputies do ordinary policing badly suited to what is actually happening. None of them are the problem. Every one of them is doing roughly the right thing given the information available, and it does not help at all, and that is a much bleaker observation than corruption would be. Sheriff Sarah Breaker objects to him constantly. She is competent, level-headed, well-liked, and she can see exactly what he is. Questioning his methods openly is something she does in front of other people, and nobody in that county has anything positive to say about the man. He shoots at a fleeing suspect near a bystander in a trailer park. Later comes the gunfire into an occupied radio booth. Escalation follows him into every room, and he keeps operating anyway. That is not a plot hole. Authority decays in practice exactly like this. Institutions are slow at withdrawing legitimacy from someone who still has the props. He has the jacket. The badge is real, and he announces himself with the correct words. Local officers, in the middle of an unfolding emergency, in a small department with no capacity to verify a federal agent's standing on a weekend, default to cooperation because the cost of wrongly obstructing a real agent is enormous, and the cost of going along with a fake one is not visible yet. Real cases of people operating for extended periods on lapsed or fabricated credentials almost always share the same anatomy. The imposter is confident, uses the correct vocabulary, and enters during a period of confusion. Confidence and jargon substitute for verification, because verification is somebody's job, and in a crisis nobody has time to be that somebody. Bright Falls hands a discharged alcoholic with a personal vendetta full run of a supernatural emergency, and it does so through nothing more sinister than institutional inertia. Then there is his name, and I want to spend a moment on it because the naming in this story is never accidental. Nightingale, a bird that sings in the dark, also the surname of the most famous nurse in history, a woman remembered specifically for going through wards at night with a lamp. The man carrying that name is the character most completely defined by his inability to bring light to anything. He is loud in the dark, constantly, screaming across a town at night, producing enormous noise and zero illumination. Every scene he is in gets worse because he is in it. Whether that reading was intended, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that this is a story where a man's initials spell out an instruction, and in a story like that, a name meaning the one who makes noise at night is worth noticing. Now the end of him, because it is the most thematically loaded death in the entire game, and it is over in about 15 seconds. Nightingale finally gets his arrest. Alan and Rusty are taken into custody at the Anderson farm and held at the sheriff's station. And Nightingale, having won, does what people who have organized their entire personality around a pursuit tend to do when the pursuit concludes. He does not feel better. Instead, he goes down to the cell to taunt. He has the pages, all of them, the ones he has been collecting across the county, believing they are evidence of the novelist's guilt. He shows them off. Alan is going away for a long time, he says, then he reads one out loud. The page he reads describes an attack on his own character. And the moment the words leave his mouth, it happens. The darkness comes through the door of a police station and takes him. Consider the exact mechanism of that. He is not killed for being close to Alan, or for interfering, or as a warning to anybody. What kills him is that he performed the text. Robert Nightingale spends the entire story as a reader. He collects the pages, he studies them, he builds a theory out of them, and he never once considers that the pages might be a live instrument rather than a record. A loaded object gets treated as a filing cabinet, and in the 1 second where he crosses from reading to reciting, from consuming the story to participating in it, the story eats him. That is the most precise statement of this whole thing's argument that the game ever makes, and it is disguised as a jump scare in a police station. There are two literary figures standing behind him, and both are useful. One is the relentless police inspector from a very long French novel, a man of absolute rectitude, who pursues one fugitive for 19 years and who, when his moral framework finally cracks, cannot survive the crack. The other is a sea captain who loses part of himself to an animal and spends the rest of his life converting an accident into a personal enemy, dragging an entire crew down with him. Both men are destroyed by the same thing, which is the refusal to let an unbearable event remain meaningless. Each would rather have a villain than a tragedy. Nightingale needed his partner's death to be somebody's fault. The alternative, that Coates was taken by something with no motive and no face and no possibility of arrest, was not something he could hold, so he built a face onto it, and the face he built belonged to a man who was, at that exact moment, being used by the actual culprit as a writing instrument. He was 3 feet from the truth, holding it in his hands, in a police station, reading it aloud. There is one last thing about Nightingale that I want to leave with you, and it concerns what he was actually doing during all those nights in the woods. He was collecting the pages, not destroying them. Leaving them where they lay was never his instinct either. Systematically gathering every scrap of that manuscript he could find across the county, and keeping them together in one place, because he believed they were evidence. Consider what that means functionally. The one person in Bright Falls most determined to stop Alan Wake spent the entire emergency assembling Alan Wake's book for him. Every page Nightingale confiscated was a page that ended up on a desk in a single stack instead of scattered in the trees. He performed, with total conviction and enormous effort, the exact task the darkness needed somebody to perform. That is the shape of almost every action taken by almost every character in this story. Sincere effort, correctly executed, pointed at the wrong thing, producing the outcome the sincere person was trying to prevent. Alice brought a typewriter. Zane wrote a poem. Hartman built a hospital. Nightingale filed the evidence, which is the pattern this valley runs on. Everybody who reaches the truth reaches it in a form they cannot use. Zane understood and erased himself. Nightingale understood and was destroyed by the paperwork. Hartman understood and refused to be changed by it. There is one person left who understood, correctly and completely, and who did neither of those things. She figured it out in 1970. She was right about all of it, and she spent the next 40 years of her life being treated as the local eccentric while she quietly built the only thing in that county capable of stopping what was coming. Nobody in Bright Falls ever thanked her. Most of them thought she was unwell. And before we get to her, hold one thought about what we have covered tonight, because it is the shape everything from here follows. 4 people have now encountered the truth about that lake. A poet found it and deleted himself. An assistant found it and monetized it. A federal agent found it sideways, through grief and dreams, and was consumed by the paperwork. Then a novelist found it and immediately began writing his way deeper in. Not one of them was stupid. None of them was weak, either. Each of them responded to genuine knowledge in a way that made perfect sense from inside their own life, and the Valley absorbed all 4 responses without difficulty, because the Valley does not care what you do with the truth. It only cares that you keep making things, which leaves one person unaccounted for, and she is the only one who found a 5th response. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Counted Light Bulbs. There is a woman living inside a hydroelectric dam who checks light bulbs for a living, alone, and has done it for 40 years. Her name is Cynthia Weaver. She lives at Bright Falls Light and Power, in a set of rooms with strange writing painted on the walls, and her single occupation is making sure that every bulb in a certain part of that town keeps burning. Specific fixtures come due for replacement by number, and she knows them. 3 of them come up constantly in her own private accounting, and she frets over the latter and the lateness of the hour and the tiredness in her legs, the way another person might fret over a sick relative. The town regards her as its resident eccentric. Harmless, a little sad, worth a shrug and a kind word and nothing more. Nightingale, in his own private notes, refers to her by the name of an ancient philosopher who was said to wander the streets of Athens in daylight carrying a lit lamp, searching for one honest man. That comparison is sharper than Nightingale probably meant it to be, because Cynthia Weaver actually is walking around with a lamp, searching for something specific, decades after everyone stopped believing there was anything to find. Go back to 1970 to understand her. She was young then, working as a writer and editor for the local paper, and she was the 3rd person orbiting Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger, nobody's poet and nobody's muse, the friend who was in love with the poet and never told him, watching him build a life with somebody else. There is a piece of the record here that most retellings smooth over because it complicates the sympathy, and I am not going to smooth it. When Barbara drowned, Cynthia grieved for her friend's loss, genuinely, and somewhere underneath that grief, she also felt something closer to relief, because the one obstacle standing between her and the man she loved had been removed. She would have been ashamed of that feeling. Most people are when they catch themselves feeling relief at someone else's tragedy for reasons that serve them personally. It is one of the least discussed and most common experiences a grieving community produces, and almost nobody admits to it. She did not get her chance. Zane spent his last months trying to write Barbara back, and then he erased himself along with her. Cynthia lost the man she loved to a woman who was already dead, twice in the same year. And then something started reaching her from inside the water. Zane, or whatever survived of Zane, began sending her instructions: protect the town's light, guard something specific for a writer who had not been born yet, or who was a child somewhere else entirely, and would not arrive in Bright Falls for another 4 decades. She had no way to verify any of it, no proof, no witnesses, nothing she could show a doctor or a newspaper editor to justify the decision she was about to make. She believed him anyway, and she reorganized her entire remaining life around a set of instructions from a dead man that would not make sense to anyone for 40 years. Think about what that actually required of her. She had to accept a role with no visible purpose and no completion date. Every other person touched by this story gets some form of confirmation eventually. Alan gets his pages. Nightingale gets his obsession and his conviction. Hartman gets his patience and his book sales. Cynthia got nothing except the certainty in her own head that the lights had to stay on, and the growing suspicion of everyone around her that she had lost her mind. There is a useful comparison here, and it is not a supernatural one at all. Consider the specific loneliness of a person who holds a true belief that nobody around them can verify. Whistleblowers before the evidence surfaces. Family members who insist for years that something is wrong with a relative's medical care before a diagnosis finally arrives. People who watched a danger coming and said so loudly and were managed rather than believed. The content of the belief does not need to be supernatural for the social experience to be identical. Something is known to you. Proof is the part you cannot supply. The people around you conclude, reasonably from their own vantage point, that you are the one with the problem. Cynthia Weaver spent 4 decades absorbing that verdict from an entire town on behalf of a stranger she would not meet until she was an old woman, because a voice she trusted told her the town would need it. Her home is covered in yellow paint, writing scrawled across the walls, and it reads, "To anyone walking in cold, like the output of a person in crisis." It probably was, at least some of the time. Holding a single, unverifiable conviction for 40 years, while the entire social world around you treats the conviction as illness, is not a stable position to occupy, and there is no reason to pretend she came through it without cost. The eccentricity is real. It is also, underneath the surface presentation, the closest thing this story has to disciplined faith rather than delusion, because the thing she believed turned out to be true. There is a specific line from the song that deserves a mention here, since Nightingale's own private notes reach for it without quite understanding what he was reaching for. The lyric calls her the Lady of the Light gone mad with the night, which the town treated as a colorful description of a sad old woman, and which was, in fact, the single most accurate sentence anyone in Bright Falls ever wrote about her. She had gone a little mad, and she had also, unmistakably, become the light. Both things were true, and the song holds them together without resolving which one matters more, which is probably the most honest thing anyone in that town ever said about her, set to music, decades before she needed anyone to understand it. Now the room itself. Deep inside the dam there is a space Cynthia calls the well-lit room, and she has kept it sealed for the entire 40 years, waiting. When Alan finally reaches her, she does not lecture him, does not demand belief, does not even fully explain herself. She opens the door and hands him a box. Inside it is a page, in Zane's handwriting, describing a memory that belongs to Alan and that Alan never told anyone. His childhood fear of the dark. A memory of his mother, sitting at the edge of his bed. The broken light switch she gave him, and the name she gave it, and the promise that flipping it would drive the monsters away. And inside the box, physically, is that same object, the clicker. Stop here, because this is the single strangest piece of continuity in the entire story, and it deserves to be sat with, rather than rushed past. Thomas Zane, in 1972, wrote a page describing a private childhood memory belonging to a man who had not been born yet. He then arranged for the physical object from that memory, an object that existed only inside Alan Wake's own life in New York City decades later, to be sitting in a locked room in Washington, waiting for him, before Alan Wake's mother ever handed her son that light switch. The story never fully resolves how this is possible, and I am not going to invent an explanation it does not provide. What matters more than the mechanism is what the gift represents. Zane did not simply predict that Alan would need a weapon. He reached backward through Alan's own childhood and made sure the one object that had already once before proven capable of driving Alan's personal darkness away would be exactly the tool waiting for him at the bottom of the lake. The cure was never invented for this fight. It was borrowed from a 7-year-old boy fighting sleep in a bedroom he shared with nobody but his own fear, decades before he ever heard of Bright Falls. There is something worth naming about why Cynthia specifically was chosen to be the keeper of that object, rather than anyone else in that town. She had spent the 4 decades preceding Alan's arrival, maintaining light, every day, every bulb, every fixture, in a place where the ordinary logic of the world says that jobs stopped mattering the moment the man who assigned it vanished. Zane's continued presence was never required to keep her doing it. All she needed was the initial instruction and her own discipline. That is, functionally, devotion practiced with no audience and no proof of efficacy, which happens to be one of the oldest and most demanding forms of religious practice human beings have ever asked of each other. Faith is usually defined, in the traditions that take it most seriously, as precisely this: belief maintained in the absence of evidence, sustained through the ordinary tedium of an unremarkable daily task, for a payoff that may never come and that the believer may not live to see. Cynthia Weaver got her payoff. Most people who live that way do not. The story is honest enough to make that a genuine event rather than a foregone conclusion, and it is honest enough to cost her almost everything on the way there. She is also the one character in this whole valley who understood the truth in 1970 and responded to it by doing something quiet, sustained, and completely unglamorous for 40 straight years, without erasing herself, without building an institution to profit from it, and without letting the grief curdle into a vendetta against an innocent man. She simply changed the light bulbs every single day for 40 years because somebody she trusted told her it would matter eventually. It mattered. There is a contrast worth drawing directly between Cynthia and Hartman here, because they are, structurally, mirror images of each other, and putting them side by side clarifies something neither portrait manages alone. Both of them were present at the origin of this catastrophe. Decades before anyone else, both understood that something real and dangerous lived under that lake, and both organized the rest of their lives around that knowledge. There the resemblance ends completely, because one of them turned the knowledge into an institution that fed on other people's suffering for profit and status, while the other turned the same knowledge into an unpaid, unglamorous, uncredited maintenance job that asked nothing of anyone else and simply kept a promise. Neither of them ever stopped believing what they saw in 1970. The difference between them was never conviction. It was what each of them was willing to do with a truth nobody else could verify, and that single fork in the road produced, on one side, a hospital that harvested artists for 40 years, and on the other, a woman quietly replacing bulb number 6, bulb number 33, and bulb number 118 for the same 40 years, so that a man she had never met would have somewhere to see by when he finally arrived. There is one final image worth holding on to before we leave her, because it says more than any summary could. Years after the events we are covering tonight, once Alan has vanished into the lake and the immediate crisis has passed, Cynthia grows too old to keep climbing the ladder herself. She passes the duty on, choosing a successor to carry the light forward, because the job cannot end simply because the person doing it has run out of years to give it. A role built to outlast one lifetime gets handed to the next person willing to carry it, the same way Zane once handed it to her. That is the closest thing to a happy ending this valley produces for anyone who understood the truth early. Not rescue. No vindication in front of the town that doubted her either. Just a successor, and a light that stays on after she can no longer be the one changing the bulbs herself. Chapter 10. The Song with the Answer Buried in It. There is a farmhouse outside Bright Falls with a recording studio built into a barn, and inside that studio, on a shelf, sits a record that has been waiting since 1976 to be listened to correctly. The Anderson brothers, Odin and Tor, built a career on that farm, playing under stage names taken from Norse mythology. and by the time Alan Wake needs them, they are both living at their farm, with severe dementia. What matters is what they knew before the disease took most of it away. They came from a family with a long tradition of clairvoyance, people who had some inherited sensitivity to exactly the kind of thing that lives under Cauldron Lake, and they encountered the dark presence directly, decades ago, and lived to describe it, which, as we have already established, makes them the only people in this entire story who can make that claim. They used what they had, which was music, and they used it the same way everyone in this story uses their own craft, as a weapon and as a container. There is a specific detail about how they made their living that deserves attention before we get to the song itself, because it explains why anyone would trust two aging rock musicians with something this important in the first place. The Andersons were not amateurs playing at mysticism. For close to a decade they toured nationally, built a genuine following, and produced work that still gets remembered by people who study the era. Their whole persona, borrowed Norse names included, was built around treating their own instruments as something closer to ritual objects than entertainment props. One of them has compared an object used in their music to an amplifier for something much older than electricity. Whether that comparison was ever meant literally or was simply stage patter dressed up for an audience, the story eventually confirms it was not exaggeration. Their music really could reach the same power the lake responds to, at a scale that eventually mattered to the survival of an entire town. Somewhere in a song written in 1976, called The Poet and the Muse, they hid the location of the one object capable of stopping the dark presence for good. By the time Alan needs that information, the two men who hid it can no longer tell him directly. The record has to speak for them. I want to spend real time on why that works, because it is not simply a convenient plot device. It reflects something true about how memory actually degrades and what survives the degradation. Dementia does not erase a person's entire mind uniformly. Research on memory in cognitive decline has consistently found that different kinds of memory fail at different rates. Recent conversations, names, the ability to form new memories at all, these tend to go first and go hardest. Older material, especially material bound up with strong emotion or with well-practiced skills, frequently survives much longer. Musicians with advanced dementia who cannot recognize their own children have been documented playing complex pieces from decades earlier with full accuracy, because the memory is stored differently. It lives in the hands and in the ear rather than in the part of the brain responsible for recalling this morning's breakfast. The Andersons built their message into a song for exactly this reason, whether or not they understood the neuroscience behind the choice. They were protecting information against a threat they could see coming, which was their own future minds, by encoding it in the one format most resistant to the specific kind of erosion they knew was on its way. That is remarkable enough as an act of foresight. What makes it more remarkable still is what they were protecting it against, on top of the dementia, which we have already covered. The sedation. Hartman's medication, dosed by the man with every reason to keep them incoherent. They anticipated an internal threat and an external one simultaneously, decades in advance, and built one solution that defended against both. Now the mechanism of retrieval itself, because it is one of the most carefully constructed sequences in the entire story. Notice too what the brothers did not do. They did not simply write the location down in plain language somewhere durable, a note in a safe or a letter to be opened later. That would have been simpler, and it would also have been useless, because a plain note is exactly the kind of object an institution like Hartman's can search for, confiscate, and destroy the moment it becomes inconvenient. A song already circulating in the world, already pressed onto records, and known to strangers who never set foot in Bright Falls, cannot be quietly removed. Hiding the truth inside something already public and already loved is a form of protection that secrecy alone could never provide. Alan and Barry find the record at the farm, on a turntable, and play it. The song describes Zane and Barbara in thinly veiled terms: poet and muse, magic lake, treasure in the depths. Buried inside the lyric is a phrase pointing toward Cynthia Weaver, the Lady of the Light, and Alan works out that the song is not simply commemorating a tragedy, It is a set of instructions. The brothers cannot tell him where to go anymore. Their younger selves already told him, 40 years in advance, in the one medium that would still be playable when the tellers themselves were gone. There is a broader thought worth sitting with here about what art actually is when you strip away the mysticism of Cauldron Lake entirely, because this valley makes literal something that is true everywhere, minus the magic. A song, a book, a painting is a way of sending something forward past the limits of a single human life and a single human memory. Every civilization that has left behind carvings, songs, and stories has been doing exactly what the Andersons did, on a slower timescale, and without a lake to enforce it. Information encoded in a form specifically built to survive is a hedge against the failure of the ordinary channels, which are frail, forgetful, and mortal. Bright Falls just makes the metaphor structural rather than incidental. The record does not merely commemorate the past. It functions mechanically as the only reliable path forward, because everyone who could have told the story out loud is either dead, gone, or losing their own memory in real time. There is a smaller detail from that same stretch of the story worth pulling out on its own, because it sits right next to the song and gets less attention than it deserves. Before any of that, Alan and Barry are offered moonshine at the farm, made using unfiltered water drawn straight from Cauldron Lake. Alan drinks it, gets thoroughly drunk, and passes out, and it is during that intoxicated blackout that he finally remembers the missing week in full. Not through a manuscript page. Nothing written was involved at all. Through a substance drawn directly from the same water that holds the dark place underneath it. Consider what that is actually saying. The lake's power does not only travel through art, it is present in the water itself, literally, physically, something you can distill and pour and drink. And enough of it delivered directly into a human body can force open a door that months of therapy and years of denial never managed to touch. There is a real and uncomfortable echo of that in how substances are sometimes used, in both clinical and non-clinical settings, to access memory that ordinary waking consciousness keeps locked away. Certain compounds are documented to lower the threshold that normally keeps traumatic or dissociated material out of conscious awareness, which is precisely why some of them are used carefully and under supervision in specific forms of trauma treatment, and precisely why the same effect is dangerous outside of that supervision. The barrier that usually protects a person from reliving an unbearable memory all at once can come down fast and without warning, and what floods back through it is not gentle. That is what happens to Alan on the Anderson farm. No supervision, no careful dosage, no professional in the room. A jar of homemade liquor made from lake water, and the entire missing week arrives at once, unfiltered, exactly the way the liquor itself was unfiltered. The hypnosis comes back to him. So does writing Zane into the story to sabotage his own manuscript from the inside. What returns is what he actually did, rather than the fragments the pages had been feeding him, one warning at a time. And this is the point in the story where Alan stops being a man reacting to a script he cannot see the whole of, and becomes a man who understands completely what he is actually in the middle of. It does not last long before Nightingale catches up to him, but for the length of that memory, on a farm outside town, drunk on water from the bottom of a lake, Alan Wake is finally, briefly, fully awake in the way that word is going to matter by the very end of this story. There is one more piece of that farmhouse sequence worth including, because it is where the story briefly lets its two ordinary human characters, the ones with no supernatural gift at all, take the stage. While Alan is unconscious from the moonshine, Barry is left standing guard over him in a barn on a working farm outside a town under active supernatural siege, with nothing but his own nerve and a stolen cardboard cutout for company. He does not run. Barry Wheeler, who makes nothing and has no defense the darkness cannot simply ignore, stays next to his unconscious best friend through the entire night, because that is what the job of being someone's oldest friend actually requires when nothing more dramatic is available to offer. That loyalty gets almost no credit in how this story is usually discussed, probably because it produces no visible power and drives no plot mechanism forward. It is simply a man staying in a dangerous place next to somebody he loves, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, which might be the least mystical and most quietly important thing anyone does across this entire ordeal. He is captured almost immediately afterward. The record has already given him what he needs before that happens, and the sequence is worth naming precisely, because it is the last calm stretch before everything accelerates toward the water. Consider the full relay that just took place, because it is the cleanest example in the whole story of what generational transmission looks like when it actually works. A poet in 1970 understood something and could not act on it directly, so he passed a piece of it forward through a woman who loved him. Two musicians in 1976 understood a different piece and could not guarantee they would remain capable of explaining it, so they passed their portion forward through a song. Neither party knew exactly who would receive the message on the other end. Zane did not know Alan Wake's name. The Andersons did not know when or whether anyone would ever need to hear that particular record again with fresh ears. And 40 years later, all of it arrived at once, in the right order, for a man neither of them had ever met, because each of them trusted a version of the future they would never personally witness enough to prepare for it anyway. Chapter 11. The Trap Built Out of Kindness. Before the farm, before the memory returns, there is a stop at a trailer park that deserves its own honest reckoning, because it is the cruelest thing the Dark Presence does in this entire story, and it does it without lifting a hand. Barry gets a call. Rose Overlake says she has found the rest of the manuscript pages, and she wants Alan and Barry to come to her trailer to collect them. It sounds on its face like the single most helpful thing anyone has offered them since this began. Understand what is actually happening to Rose before the two men arrive. The Dark Presence touched her the previous night, and what it offered her specifically, in order to secure her cooperation, was the position of Alan Wake's muse. Sit with that word one more time, because it has now appeared 3 times in this story, attached to 3 different women, and each appearance clarifies the last. Barbara was called it by a man who loved her genuinely and also needed her. Alice was called it by a husband whose affection for the word never quite covered how much he leaned on what it produced. And now the darkness itself, which understands nothing about love and everything about appetite, offers the exact same title to a woman it has never met as a person, purely because it correctly identified what she wanted most and built a lure out of it. Rose wanted to be seen by the writer she loved from a distance. The thing possessing her did not manufacture that desire. It only needed to notice it and hand it back to her wearing the shape of a promise. She calls Barry, sincerely, believing she is helping the men she has come to genuinely like over the preceding days, and then serves them coffee. The coffee is drugged, they drink it, and lose the rest of the day. While they are unconscious, Alan has a vision, a man in a diving suit telling him to turn a light on. When he wakes, Barbara Jagger is standing over his bed, ordering him back to the manuscript, and he reaches for a light switch and drives her off. He finds Rose in the next room, rocking, reciting the same greeting she gives customers at the diner over and over, hollowed out, present in body and absent in every other way. That image is the same one we sat with back in the first chapter, watching what the darkness does to the possessed loggers in the woods. The body kept running. Underneath it, the person kept generating the same small loop, unable to stop it, unable to be heard over it. What makes Rose's version worse than Stucky's is that nobody handed her an axe. She never became a physical threat. Her possession produced no violence at all, only a betrayal she was never conscious of committing, and will presumably spend the rest of her life not fully understanding. There is a piece of real psychology worth bringing in here, because Rose's fate is not an isolated horror movie beat. It maps onto something that happens to real people who get used, without their knowledge, as the conduit for someone else's harm. People who unknowingly assist in a crime, a fraud, or a manipulation, having been genuinely deceived rather than complicit, frequently carry guilt afterward that is disproportionate to their actual culpability. The clinical picture resembles trauma more than it resembles ordinary regret, because the person's own sense of themselves as someone who would never do such a thing has been violated from the inside. using their own hands, without their consent or awareness. They cannot simply resolve to be more careful next time, the way a person recovers from an honest mistake. Their fear becomes structural. If it happened once, invisibly, using the very best parts of who they are, meaning their warmth, their loyalty, their desire to be helpful, then nothing about their own character can be trusted to protect them from it happening again. Rose will carry some version of that. Barry, watching his friend's trailer wrecked and his coffee drugged, draws the wrong conclusion in the moment and assumes she turned on them deliberately, which is its own small tragedy layered on top of the first one, because the one person closest to her now believes a betrayal took place that never actually did. Alan understands the truth faster than Barry does. He sees Rose rocking in that chair and recognizes, correctly, that she was used rather than complicit. It is one of the only moments in this entire story where Alan's professional habit of reading people accurately actually protects someone, rather than only protecting himself. It is worth asking why Alan, of all people, is the one who reads that room correctly, given how badly he has misread almost everything else up to this point. The likeliest answer is professional rather than personal. 6 novels of writing believable human behavior on the page trained him to notice when a person's outward performance and their inward state have come apart, because that gap is the exact thing a crime novelist has to render convincingly for a reader to believe it. He recognized Rose's rocking and muttering for what it was, because he has spent years constructing characters who crack in precisely that fashion, on paper, under his own control. Watching it happen for real, to someone he can no longer help, is his craft returning to him as a diagnosis rather than as a tool. It does not save her from what already happened. Understanding a wound after it has been made does not close it. There is a specific cruelty embedded in the choice of what the darkness offered her, and it deserves one more pass before we move on, because it is not identical to what it offered Barbara or Alice. Barbara received devotion from a man already deeply in love with her. Alice received a husband, returned from years of shared history. Rose received nothing of the kind. What she was handed was a fantasy of proximity to a man she had spoken to for perhaps 10 total minutes of her life, constructed entirely out of the one-sided intimacy of reading his books. The darkness did not need to manufacture affection in her case. It only needed to recognize that the affection was already there, aimed at someone who had no idea it existed, and offer to close that distance. That is a colder kind of exploitation than what happened to the other 2 women in this story, because it required no genuine relationship to work with at all. Rose's vulnerability was not a bond the darkness corrupted. It was a longing the darkness simply located and pointed toward a door. Now widen the lens, because this chapter is where a pattern that has been building since the very first page of this analysis becomes impossible to miss. Alice brought a typewriter out of love and handed the darkness its opening. Zane wrote a poem out of grief and handed the darkness a body. Rose served coffee out of devotion and handed the darkness 2 unconscious men and an entire afternoon to work with. Every major opening this story's antagonist has ever exploited came through warmth rather than through weakness. Fear did not open these doors. Love did every single time, offered by people who had no way of knowing what they were actually extending it toward. That is a genuinely bleak thing for a piece of horror fiction to be arguing, and I do not think the story is arguing it by accident. A monster that could only exploit cruelty would be a comforting monster, because most people do not consider themselves cruel and could reasonably assume they are safe from it. Requiring kindness, generosity, and devoted attachment instead makes this one a monster that every decent person in this story remains permanently vulnerable to, precisely because of what makes them decent. Before Nightingale finds them, there is a smaller aftermath worth sitting in, because it says something the chase sequence that follows does not have time to say. Barry, walking away from that trailer, takes the cardboard cutout of Alan that Rose kept in her home, the one built from a promotional photograph, propped in the corner where she could look at it when the real man was far away. He takes it almost as evidence, proof to himself that something had gone wrong there, that Rose's devotion had curdled into betrayal. That assumption is wrong. But the impulse behind taking that cutout is worth naming honestly. It is grief for a friendship he assumes just ended, carried out by stealing the one object in the room that represented what she actually wanted, which was never Alan's harm. His attention was always the whole of it. Nightingale finds Alan and Barry not long after they leave Rose's trailer, corners them outside, and the pursuit that has been building since the missing week finally catches up in full. From here the story moves fast. The Anderson farm, the record, the moonshine, the memory returning all at once, and then Nightingale again, closing in with the pages he has been collecting, believing to the very end that he is the one hunting a guilty man. We already know what waits for him at the end of that chase. What we have not yet reached is what waits for Alan at the bottom of the lake, once every one of these people, the loyal ones and the broken ones and the ones who never woke up at all, has finally played their part in getting him there. He goes down into that water carrying a light switch built for a 7-year-old, a memory his own moonshine forced back into place, and the understanding, hard-won and very late, that everyone who ever tried to help him in that valley was also, without exception, the mechanism that delivered him to the door. Chapter 12. Everyone who reads the wrong line. There is a jail cell in the basement of a small sheriff's station, and inside it a novelist is sitting with nothing left to negotiate with. Alan and Barry are captured at the Anderson farm and brought in, and for a short stretch of this story the chase finally stops. Nightingale has his man, the badge is his, however lapsed, and he has the pages, stacked and organized, the entire scattered manuscript, reassembled by his own obsessive effort into one physical pile on a desk. By every measure that has mattered to him for the length of this ordeal, he has won. We already know what happens next, because we covered it 2 chapters ago from his side of the room. He goes down to gloat, reads a line from the manuscript aloud, without understanding what reading it aloud actually does, and the darkness takes him through the station door in under 15 seconds. What we have not sat with is what that moment does to everyone left standing in the building once he is gone. The pages are still there. Nightingale's entire collection, gathered across days of pursuit, sits unattended in an empty office in a station that just lost an agent to something none of the remaining deputies can explain or defend against. Sheriff Breaker, who has spent this whole story being the one competent, grounded presence in a town coming apart, is now standing in a building with a hole in the ceiling where a person used to be, holding the pieces of a story she never wanted any part of. She releases Alan and Barry, not out of sentiment, and not because she has suddenly decided Alan is innocent of everything. She releases them because the town is now under direct assault, and she has run out of better options. That decision deserves a moment of real credit, because it is the single clearest example in this entire narrative of an institution actually updating in response to evidence, rather than clinging to a story that no longer fits the facts in front of it. Breaker watched a man get pulled through a door by something with no visible cause, and she adjusted immediately. 4 decades to catch up, the way Hartman needed, was never required of her. Neither did she need to be right about everything and wrong about one target the way Nightingale was. She saw a thing that violated her understanding of how the world works, and she let it change her mind in real time. That is worth naming plainly, because it is rare in this story, and it does not get much credit for being rare. Most of the people we have covered took months, years, or entire lifetimes to update on new information, and several of them never did. Breaker takes about 10 seconds. Together, Alan and Breaker fight through what remains of the town toward the dam, where Cynthia Weaver is waiting with the object that has been sitting in the dark for 40 years. They reach her. She opens the well-lit room. Alan reads the page describing his own childhood, takes the clicker into his hand, and understands, finally, completely, what he actually has to do. Barry joins them along the way, and the 3 of them, along with whatever help the town can still offer, make it out by helicopter to the last stretch of this journey, which is Cauldron Lake itself, at night, with the storm that has been building since the missing week finally breaking directly overhead. Before we go down into the water with him, There is a thread worth tying off, because it belongs here, rather than anywhere later. Consider the full inventory of people this valley has produced across the length of this story, and notice the shape they make when you line them up together. A poet who understood and erased himself. An assistant who understood and built a business. A federal agent who half understood and was consumed by the paperwork he was so proud of collecting. Then a waitress who understood nothing and was used anyway, purely because of who she loved from a distance. And a sheriff who understood almost immediately and adjusted without drama, followed by a woman in a power plant who understood from the very beginning and simply, quietly, kept a light on. None of those responses were foolish. Every one of them made sense from inside the specific life that produced it. And only one of them, the quietest, least dramatic, least rewarded of all of them, actually worked. There is one more figure worth adding to that inventory before we move on, because he does not fit neatly into either category, and his absence from the list so far has been deliberate. Barry Wheeler understood almost nothing about what was actually happening in that valley for most of the story, and he never once stopped following his best friend into it anyway. Not on the list of people who understood and paid a price is where he belongs, because genuine understanding largely eluded him until very late. Instead, he belongs to a different, smaller category, which might be the rarest one this story produces. The person who did not need to understand in order to stay. Loyalty, in his case, substituted for comprehension completely, and it held up under exactly the same pressures that broke or transformed everyone who did understand. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the person who required the least explanation turned out to need the least correcting too. Alan Wake is about to become the 7th entry on that list, and unlike everyone who came before him, he is about to get the chance to choose his response with full knowledge of what every other choice has cost. Chapter 13. What Waits Under the Water. Alan goes into Cauldron Lake, and the moment he crosses the surface, he is somewhere that does not obey the physics of anywhere else in this story. The dark place, up close, is disorienting in a very specific and deliberate way. It is not simply dark. Everything in it rearranges. Familiar shapes drift past at wrong angles. Structures from Bright Falls appear submerged and half-formed, as if the town itself has a shadow copy resting at the bottom of the lake, waiting for the right kind of attention to bring it fully into being. The dark presence uses this space to throw everything it has left at him. Hallucinations built from his own guilt, visions of failure dressed up as certainty, attempts to convince him to simply stop, to give up the search, to let the water settle over him the way it settled over everyone else who ever went looking for something down here. He does not stop. There is a reason for that resilience worth naming plainly, and it connects directly back to everything we established in the earlier chapters about what this lake actually responds to. The dark presence's hallucinations are, in the end, only another attempt at persuasion, the same tool it has used on every other person in this story. It cannot force Alan to give up any more than it could force him to write. All it can do is make giving up look attractive, the same way it made a typewriter look like help and a coffee visit look like kindness. And Alan, for the first time in this entire ordeal, is finally seeing the persuasion for exactly what it is while it is happening, rather than only recognizing it afterward. And partway through that descent, Thomas Zane meets him. This is the second time in the story that Zane has intervened directly, and it is worth noting how differently the two interventions read. The first time, back during the missing week, Zane arrived inside Alan's own manuscript, a figure Alan himself had written into the story as an act of sabotage against the dark presence. This time, at the bottom of the lake, Zane appears on his own initiative in a diving suit, exactly as the town's oldest folklore describes him, offering guidance rather than rescue. He tells Alan the truth about Barbara, that the thing wearing her has no heart, literally a hollow space where one should be, and that the only way through her is to fill that absence with something she cannot counterfeit. He introduces the concept of Mr. Scratch, a double who will return to the surface world in Alan's place, Once Alan commits to finishing the story from inside the dark place, a necessary and deeply unsettling piece of the arrangement that Alan has no real ability to refuse if he wants any version of himself to walk among the people he loves again. Then Zane steps back, and Alan continues alone, and finds Birdleg Cabin sitting at the bottom of the lake, exactly where it stood on the surface, as if the entire structure simply sank in place and kept existing down here the whole time. Inside, it is Barbara Jagger. Before the mechanics, one more thing about Barbara herself, because this is the last time she appears in this story, and she deserves to be seen clearly one final time, rather than only as an obstacle to clear. The woman who drowned in 1968, the one who baked for community events and won a pageant and was loved without complication by an entire town, has not been present in any of this. Not in the funeral dress at the diner, nor standing over Alan's hypnotized body dictating a manuscript. Not here either, at the bottom of the lake, with a hole where a heart should be. Barbara Jagger has been absent from her own story since the morning she went into the water, and everything wearing her name and her face across 4 decades of this narrative has been something else entirely, something that borrowed her shape because a grieving man handed it the opening to do so. Destroying what stands in that cabin is not, in any sense that matters, destroying her. She was never the thing Alan had to defeat. Rather, she was the first and most complete victim of everything this analysis has spent hours describing, and she has been gone, genuinely and permanently gone, since long before this story even started. He walks toward her, and for the first time in this entire story he sees her plainly, without the funeral dress functioning as camouflage, without the friendly diner transaction that first handed him his cabin keys. There is a hole where her heart should be. He drives his hand into that space and activates the clicker, and light pours out of her eyes and mouth, and she comes apart. Sit with the mechanics of that moment for a second, because they are worth being precise about. The weapon that finally ends the Dark Presence's 40-year occupation of Barbara Jagger's body is not a gun, not fire, not any of the conventional tools the story has spent hours training the player to rely on. It is a broken light switch given to a frightened 7-year-old by his mother, carried into adulthood, handed off as a half-joke to a frightened wife, and then reclaimed at the one moment it was always actually needed. Every other weapon in this story runs out of ammunition and requires replenishing. The clicker never does, because it was never really a weapon. It was always closer to a promise, something a parent gives a child to make an unbearable night survivable, applied here at the scale of an entire town rather than one bedroom. There is a genuinely striking connection worth making here, and it involves the same author whose fingerprints have been all over this story since the pseudonym novel and the Lake House and the Killed Off detective series. That author has one recurring image that appears across an enormous amount of his other work. The idea that childhood belief, however irrational it looks from the outside, is sometimes the only weapon capable of standing against something adults have long since stopped believing exists. Monsters that only adults have lost the ability to see. Faith that only works because it has not yet been talked out of a person by the world. Alan Wake's clicker belongs unmistakably to that same tradition, and the story earns the connection honestly rather than borrowing it for cheap resonance, because everything we have covered about Alan's childhood fear, his mother's ritual, and his eventual handoff of that ritual to Alice has been building toward exactly this weapon, in exactly this hand, for the entire length of the analysis. There is a version of this same idea running through a body of research on what actually happens when a community is asked to grieve someone whose death was violent, sudden, and publicly consumed, rather than privately mourned. The person the community remembers, in cases like that, frequently stops resembling the actual individual within a surprisingly short time. What survives instead is a symbol, built collectively, shaped by whatever the community needed the death to mean, and the real person underneath the symbol becomes almost impossible to recover once enough years and enough retellings have passed over the story. Bright Falls did that to Barbara Jagger for 4 decades without any supernatural assistance required at all. The Dark Presence did not invent that process. It only moved into a vacancy the town's own grief had already created and left standing open. With Barbara gone, the dark presence loses its avatar, its face, the specific vessel it has worn for 4 decades. What remains is formless and enormous and still very much alive underneath the water, and Alan understands that destroying one body wearing the darkness was never going to be enough to end the thing itself. That fight is not the one this story actually resolves. The resolution comes somewhere else entirely, in a room with a typewriter, and it is worth being honest that the confrontation with Barbara, dramatic as it is, functions as clearing an obstacle rather than as the climax proper. Alan surfaces from that confrontation inside the sunken cabin, alone, with the manuscript waiting. And here is where every single thread this analysis has been pulling on for hours finally converges into one decision, made by one man, in one room, with no editor standing over his shoulder for the first time since this entire ordeal began. Chapter 14. The ending he chose to write. Alan Wake sits down at the typewriter in Birdleg Cabin, submerged in Cauldron Lake, with the dark presence weakened but not destroyed, and he has to finish the story he started writing weeks earlier under hypnosis and grief and a dead woman's careful editorial guidance. There is a specific irony worth stopping on before he even sits down to write, because it explains why this moment carries the weight it does after everything we have covered tonight. For 1 year before any of this began, Alan Wake could not produce a single usable sentence. That block was presented, in the early chapters of this analysis, as a wound, a professional catastrophe, the thing eating his marriage and his self-regard from the inside. And now, at the exact moment when finishing a piece of writing correctly has become the only thing standing between his wife's freedom and permanent catastrophe, the man who could not write for 2 years has to produce the single most important few pages of his entire career, under conditions no working novelist has ever had to write inside of, with no possibility of revision once the ink, so to speak, is down. He understands by this point exactly what a story requires in this valley, not a wish, no demand either. A completed piece of craft with internal balance, escalation that resolves rather than simply stops, cause connected properly to effect. The lake will not honor anything less finished than that, which is the same rule that has protected Bright Falls from every half-formed, desperate impulse anyone has ever had standing on that shoreline. So he writes an ending built on balance rather than victory. Light and darkness, cause and effect, guilt and atonement, each one requiring its counterweight, because that, he finally understands, is precisely where Thomas Zane went wrong 4 decades earlier. Zane tried to write a pure gift, an unearned return with no cost attached anywhere in the structure, and the lake filled that unbalanced request with something that was not what he asked for, because nothing that unbalanced can actually hold. Alan is not going to make the same mistake. Whatever he asks the lake for, he is going to make sure the story pays its own way. The specific cost he settles on is himself. Alice escapes. She rises out of Cauldron Lake and reaches the shore, shaken, having spent more than a week in the dark place with no clear memory of most of it, but alive and free, and no longer trapped anywhere beneath that water. That is the release valve of the entire manuscript, the single unambiguous good outcome this whole catastrophe manages to produce. It is worth being honest about how limited that outcome actually is, set against the full scope of what this story has cost. Alice comes home changed, a week and more of missing time, gaps in her own memory that will presumably never fully close, a husband who is gone in a way she cannot explain to anyone who was not there. Her survival is real, and it matters enormously. And it is also not a clean rescue in any sense that erases what happened to her, that much of her own life comes back to her. What does not come back is the version of her marriage that existed before a typewriter arrived in a cabin on an island, and no amount of relief at her own escape changes that particular loss. And Alan does not follow her out. There is a genuine question worth asking here, and I do not think this story gives an easy answer to it. Could he have written an ending where both of them walked free? The lake's own rule, established all the way back when we first discussed how the presence is bound by craft, is balance. Every gift requires a counterweight of equal size. If that rule is genuinely fixed rather than merely convenient for the plot, then no version of this ending existed where nobody paid a price proportional to what was being asked. Someone in that cabin was always going to stay behind. Alan's choice was not between sacrifice and freedom. It was only ever a choice about which one of them the sacrifice would fall on, and he made sure it was not going to be her. He stays, and Mr. Scratch, the double the dark presence created, rises in his place, walking among the people who love Alan Wake, while the real man remains behind at the bottom of the lake to keep writing. There is a very deliberate structural choice buried in that arrangement that deserves to be named directly, because it is the reversal I promised you back at the start of tonight, the one I said would change how you hear the ending once we got here. Waking up, in this story, is never once presented as an escape. Every single person who reaches genuine clarity about what is actually happening in that valley pays for the clarity immediately and in full. Zane understood and erased himself. Nightingale understood, too late and about the wrong target, and was consumed within seconds of finally being right. Cynthia understood and spent 4 decades absorbing an entire town's quiet contempt in exchange for a payoff she might never have lived to see. And now Alan understands, more completely than anyone else in the whole of this narrative, and his reward for that completeness is not freedom. It is an indefinite sentence, alone, at the bottom of a lake, writing to hold back something that can never quite be fully finished off, only balanced against one manuscript at a time, forever. That is what the ending line is actually telling you. Alan sits at the typewriter, having just traded his own remaining life for his wife's, and types the final words of departure. It's not a lake, it's an ocean. We covered the geography of that sentence back in Chapter 4, the way it corrects a category error the whole town had been making about the size and shape of what lives under that water. It is worth pulling that thread all the way through now, since we have finally arrived at the moment the line was written. An ocean does not merely mean bigger, it means connected. Lakes are closed systems, self-contained, isolated from every other body of water around them. Oceans touch every shore on the planet, feed into each other, share currents that move across the entire globe without acknowledging any border. If Cauldron Lake was ever truly a lake, then the danger it posed was local, containable, a Bright Falls problem that a fence and a cover story about volcanic gas could plausibly manage. An ocean cannot be fenced. Alan's final sentence is not a description of size for its own sake. What it confesses is that the thing he has spent this entire ordeal fighting was never a regional problem to begin with, and that everyone who told themselves otherwise, the government with its fence, the town with its festival, held directly above the danger, Hartman with his private research project, was operating on a category error large enough to have gotten every one of them killed. And then Alice's voice says his name, Alan, wake up. Every casual retelling of this story treats that line as the release, the moment the nightmare finally lets him go. And I told you at the very beginning of tonight that I thought that reading gets it backward. Here at the end is the full case for why. Alan does not wake up into freedom. He wakes up into 13 years, at minimum, trapped in the dark place, making repeated attempts to write his own way out, and repeatedly failing, hunted eventually by his own doppelganger, watched from a distance by people who love him and cannot reach him. In other words, he wakes up into precisely the condition that this entire valley has been training us to recognize across every single chapter of tonight's story. Clarity in Bright Falls has never once been a reward. It has been the price of admission into a kind of suffering that the comfortably confused are simply never asked to pay. Compare that fate directly against the alternative available to him. He could have stayed confused. Hartman offered him exactly that, kindly, professionally, from a hospital bed, and all it would have cost was accepting a comfortable lie about his own sanity, and letting Alice's death, in whatever version of it actually occurred, stand as an ordinary tragedy rather than a supernatural abduction. Nightingale offered a version of that too, in his own way, a simple story where a guilty writer gets punished and the universe makes sense again. Even Barbara offered it, in the cabin, in the very first hours of this ordeal, whispering that maybe Alice was upstairs the whole time. Maybe none of this needed to be as complicated or as costly as it was about to become. There is a final comparison worth drawing here, back to the very first chapter of tonight's analysis, because it closes a loop that has been open since the wreck on the mountain road. Alan began this entire story by refusing to investigate his own missing week, walking past the single most alarming fact of his adult life toward the safety of plot and momentum instead. That refusal was understandable. It was also, in the terms this whole analysis has been building toward, a form of staying asleep. He chose not to look at the thing that would have cost him the most to look at directly. By the final cabin, at the bottom of the lake, he has become someone who can no longer make that choice. Every instinct that once let him look away has been burned out of him by everything this valley put him through. And what remains is a man who looks directly at the worst possible outcome, understands it completely, and writes toward it anyway because the alternative, refusing to look one more time, would cost Alice her life. The distance between the man refusing to investigate his own crime scene in Chapter 1 and the man calmly writing his own permanent disappearance in this final chapter is the entire distance this story actually travels. Everything else, the taken, the pages, the pursuit, the lodge, the trailer, the farm, was the process of closing that distance one refusal at a time. Alan refused every single one of those offers. He kept choosing to know more, at every single juncture this story presented him with, right up until the moment that knowledge required him to write himself into permanent isolation to save the one person he actually loved. That is the actual shape of the phrase waking up in this story. Once you have watched every other person who ever woke up pay for it, it does not mean the nightmare ends. What it means is that you have finally stopped letting someone else write your life for you, and you are now fully, permanently responsible for what you do with that authorship, including when the honest answer is that the only ending available to you is the one where you do not get to leave. Alan Wake spends this entire game, from the wrecked car on the mountain road to the sunken cabin at the bottom of the lake, slowly waking up in exactly that sense, not into rescue, into authorship. And authorship in this valley has never once been free. We have one more thread left before this story is finished, and it belongs to the town itself rather than to any single person in it, because Bright Falls does not simply close up and go quiet once Alan disappears beneath the water. It keeps living with what happened to it, the way every town this darkness has ever touched eventually has to. And there is one final image waiting on the shore that ties everything we have covered tonight into its proper place. Chapter 15. The Town That Keeps the Festival Going. The morning after Alan Wake disappears into Cauldron Lake, Bright Falls wakes up and, for the most part, goes back to normal. The storm passes, and the power comes back on block by block. Deerfest, the annual festival that has been building toward its opening weekend since before any of this started, goes ahead more or less on schedule. Banners still hanging on the main street, a crowd gathering for a celebration that was never once canceled despite everything that happened underneath it. The final images of this story show ordinary townspeople dancing, eating, carrying on with the specific stubborn normalcy small towns are good at, while the people who actually understood what almost happened to them either cannot speak about it or have no memory of it at all. That juxtaposition is not an oversight. It is the argument of this entire ending stated one more time in a single wide shot. Rose Maringer appears in that closing sequence too, and she is worth one last look before we close this out completely. She stands near the diner holding a lantern, watching the festival from slightly outside it, still touched by something the ordinary crowd around her cannot see. A clean explanation for what happened to her in that trailer never arrives, nor does any real understanding of why she is drawn to keep a light burning even after the immediate danger has passed. What she gets, instead, is a quiet, unglamorous continuation of exactly the role Cynthia Weaver held for 4 decades before her, passed forward without ceremony, to a woman who was never given the chance to consent to inheriting it. Barry keeps looking for his friend. Alice, once she recovers enough to function, keeps looking too, in her own way. Unable to fully explain to anyone what she actually experienced during the time she cannot clearly remember, the town keeps its version of events, which involves none of what we have spent this entire analysis reconstructing. Officially, whatever happened in Bright Falls that week gets filed as a storm, a series of unfortunate accidents, a missing persons case that never gets closed. That gap between what the town believes happened and what we now understand actually happened is the last thing worth naming plainly before we finish. Every person this story followed tonight tried, in their own way, to bridge exactly that gap. Zane tried to warn the future through erasure. The Andersons tried through a song. Cynthia tried through 40 years of unpaid maintenance work nobody thanked her for. Alan tried, in the end, through the only method available to him, which was finishing the story correctly and accepting what finishing it correctly required him to give up. None of them ever got to explain themselves to the town they were protecting. Bright Falls dances at its festival every year with no idea how many people quietly gave up everything they had to make sure there was still a festival left to dance at. He is still down there, writing.